and evening sessions are part of this group, which Jose Schenkman in Colombia convened with the co-president, Andre Correa de Lago. So this is, I guess, what we're seeing is this kind of bridging between academic, environmental economics and climate policy, which have been somewhat separate for a long time. So it's great to have all of you here. I think without further ado, I've been told to say that the kitchen is that way. You want a cup of tea or something, and then the toilets are that way. But I think we'll be meeting here throughout the week, so we'll get to know one another. But as I say, loyalty is everything. So to go to as many things as you can, because that's kind of how the whole thing works, including the evening session. Okay, so let's begin with the agriculture first. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for organizers for setting this wonderful conference. I'm going to talk to you today about a paper on how large population shocks induced by out-resettlement affects agricultural productivity of descending locations. So to motivate this a little bit, the World Bank estimates that by 2050, over 260 million people are going to be internally displaced because of climate change and declining productivity. And increasingly, planned resettlements are being considered as a way of mitigating the effects of climate change and demographic factors. And there's a long-standing debate on how population shocks affect productivity, agricultural productivity in particular, and vice versa. So what I ask in this paper is essentially, how do large out-migration shocks that are induced by resettlement programs like the ones I'm going to explore in this paper, how do they affect agricultural productivity of the origin location? And I study this in the context, in the Ethiopian context, making use of somewhat horrific, but from a research point of view, an interesting natural experiment. Following a severe drought and famine between 1984 and 86, the Ethiopian government had a government-mandated resettlement program where they moved people from one part of the country to another part of the country. And this presents us with a unique opportunity to study how out-migration shocks affect agricultural productivity for some. One is, of course, part of the rationale for this resettlement was the environmental adversities, largely the severe drought of 1984, and then land degradation that happened particularly on the central and northern highlands. And unfortunately, under this program, people were forced and rushed to settle, and so often when studying migration outcomes, maybe concerned about selection of migrants. And the way this program was implemented was unfortunately had with the disregard for the rights of the settlers and as well as the host communities. And despite the rationale related to environmental adversities, there's variation in the intensity of out-resettlement across locations that were similarly exposed to the 1984 drought, as well as the land degradation concern. Right? And so my goal is not to examine or to do an impact analysis of the resettlement program, as I said, because it's a huge program that has wide-ranging effects, but rather to use kind of the variation in the origin location that's generated by this program to understand how does the change in the population density that's induced by this program affect agricultural productivity of the origin locations. So in the interest of time, I may not spend a lot of time on this, but it bears pointing out that we're in this Arthur Lewis building. So part of kind of there's an old literature related to the existence of surplus labor in rural areas. In particular, the policymakers' rationale for relocating people from the northern and central islands is really rooted in this idea that there was a lot of surplus labor and that they could foster better economic development by reallocating labor to other parts of the country where land was available. And there's also, of course, an old literature debate on how changes in population affect agricultural productivity, which is challenging to identify because it's difficult to find a good source of variation and changes in population density. But unfortunately, this program, because of kind of the sudden and large-scale nature of the resettlement of people, you have this this interesting natural experiment that allows us to look at, how does changes in population affect agricultural productivity. So to give you a little bit about the background, resettlement, both planned and unplanned, have a long history in Ethiopia. The 1984-86 one is particularly unique because of the codes and the scale. This is showing you the SPEI, which is a measure of drought severity. As you can see, in 1984, the SPEI fell essentially more than 2 standard deviations from the long-run mean. So there was a severe drought. And maybe those of you who are old enough may know about Live Aid. There was a huge relief effort that was organized globally to address kind of the famine that followed this drought. And preceding the drought, the government was already planning to resettle people. Particularly in 1983, they had done a study where they've concluded they had planned to move about 3 to 4 million people over a span of a decade, because of concerns about high population density in the northern and central highlands. In 1984, almost 90% of the population used to live in the central and northern highlands, which only accounted for about 38% of the area. So there was high population density, and as a result, there was substantial erosion of the highland areas. And so this was kind of in the background. And when the drought in 84 happened and the subsequent famine, the government essentially kind of partly to save face and partly as a way of addressing this kind of what they considered a persistent problem, that they would relocate people from the northern and central highlands to arguably less populated areas in the west and southwest of the country. And the goal of this resettlement program was essentially they wanted to move about 1.5 million people, as I said, mostly from these drought-prone areas, and they promised them that they would gain land in the destination locations, and that they would be self-sustaining within years. The program was heavily criticized by international donors as well as leaders, partly because it essentially shifted resources that were allocated to the famine relief, to this resettlement program, and it was just a large-scale program that was being done in the middle of the famine. And unfortunately, a lot of people died in transit from the famine-prone areas to the destinations, and because of the kind of haphazard implementation of the program, there was a lot of concerns, both about the welfare of the settlers as well as the host communities. So the plan was drawn, this is how hasty it was. It was drawn in October 1984. Within 6 months, they'd already moved 340,000 people, right? So this is showing you the monthly number of people that were moved. And then they had to stop it by 1986, partly because of severe external pressures. And of course, by the end, they had moved about 600,000 people. However, this was far short of kind of the initial 1.5 million people they wanted to move. So if you look at the variation, there was a resettlement or some sort of out resettlement in about a fourth of the district. And if you look at within the districts where there was any out resettlement, the average was about 4.6% of the population was moved out, but there is substantial variation. Some districts had a lot of people moved out, and a lot of districts had a few people moved out. And geographically, essentially the resettled originated, as I said, from northern highlands as well as some central highlands that were densely populated, and they were moved to this west and southwest part of the country. Right? So what predicts out resettlement? So in this paper, essentially, I'm looking at what's happening to the sending locations. So what predicts the intensity of out resettlement? Part of it is as I said, is related to drought severity. This is showing you at the district level the severity of the drought in 1984. Right, parts of the northern highlands were affected, but as we saw from the previous graph, there were also a lot of people moved out of the central highlands that were not affected by the drought, but that had a substantial level of population density. And so these two factors were the factors that were listed in the government's planning documents. And I also formally look at the correlation of different baseline characteristics in terms of what predicts the intensity of out resettlement. The first one is just looking at cross-sectional relationship. The second column does the same thing, but within our rajas. So you should think of our rajas as one level above the districts. And as you can see, kind of population density places that had a greater population density were the ones where a lot more people were moved out. And in this case, it's also the places that had more severe drought in 1984. But in general, these factors, like a lot of the kind of the baseline factors I considered, do not seem to explain the variation in the out-resettlement intensity. Part of it is because, as I said, it was kind of the arbitrariness with which it was implemented. In fact, there's evidence that provinces were essentially given quotas for the number of people to move out, and those quotas were essentially passed down to our rajas and to districts and local officials. And unfortunately, the part of the use of force was related to these quotas because the officials, the cadres, and their desire to meet their quotas were essentially forcing people to move out. I use this in kind of an IV strategy where I look at the kind of the centrally imposed quotas as an instrument or to instrument for the actual out-resettlement intensity. And part of the reason is because the program, as we saw from the graph earlier, it ended kind of abruptly because of substantial external pressures. And this is a quote from Davide, who was the head of the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission, which was the organization initially in charge of the resettlement program. And he argues that essentially this plan was a result of neither research nor long-term planning, right? And it was kind of a spontaneous act. There was similar level of disregard actually where they sent them. Davide argues actually that they Mengistu was at the time the head of the state, took helicopter rides around west and southwestern parts of the country, and that's how he decided where some of the destination locations should be. And so there's unfortunately a substantial amount of like kind of arbitrariness in both the selection of the settlers as well as the destination locations. This compares the characteristics of the settlers as well as the origin population. Broadly, they tend to be similar. The people who were moved out tend to be similar to those that kind of stayed behind. Because of data limitation, I can't show a lot, but from what I can find, for example, if you look at the age distribution, the resettled population tend to be slightly in the kind of older, they tend to be in the working age, which was part of the criteria because they wanted to move people who could reasonably establish themselves. But broadly, they look similar. If you look at the educational, their composition and their education and their household size as well as occupation. Okay, so what were kind of the specific challenges that this resettlement is planning to address? Part of this is because of, as you saw earlier, the kind of the severe land degradation that happened in the northern and central highlands. In 1975, the government had this massive land reform, where tenancy was essentially outlawed. So all land became public. And not only that, essentially families were limited up to 10 hectares of holding. And that meant that over time, essentially, as people are having more children, in Ethiopia, land tends to be divided among family members, you end up having substantial fragmentation of land. And because of the prohibition of sale or leasing of land, that also limited both kind of reallocation across individuals, also the ability for people to sell their land and move to urban areas, for example, right? And during that time, the population essentially doubled between 1960 and 1984. And so this combination of the land reform related restrictions, which limited internal mobility, and the growing population resulted in kind of substantial land fragmentation and degradation in the northern highland. And so, which is why the government was planning to move, but even prior to the famine, move people from these northern and central highlands. And the idea was that essentially this resettlement could be viewed as an intervention that facilitates the internal mobility of people or farmers that they consider were stuck in the northern highlands, partly because of kind of the restrictions on land transactions, as well as kind of people's attachment to their ethnic homeland. And so the resettlement can lessen the kind of the impact of population pressures on environmental outcomes in the origin locations by lessening land fragmentation degradation, by potentially reallocating surplus labor from these highlands. It could also potentially have an impact on changing the composition of the people who are moved out and who tend to stay. Because of data limitation, I don't have data at the individual level who's resettled or not, so this is a little bit hard to tease out. Okay. So to look at this, essentially, I compiled a bunch of data sets. I digitized reports from the 1988 census of resettlement areas, which gives me at the district level how many people were moved out from each district. I also digitized district level reports on agricultural outcomes, which gives me data, unfortunately, for only 2 years, for 1982 and 1983. So I have 2 pre-treatment years data. And then we have individual level or plot level data in some cases on agricultural outcomes from since 1995. And then I have some Auraja level data on land distribution, and I complement this with remote sensing based data sets on NDVI as well as drought severity. And so the main identification strategy is essentially it's a difference in difference, where I'm comparing or I'm exploiting the variation in the intensity of out-resettlement, and including district and year fixed effect. And because of the kind of the potential effects of drought intensity and the population density, I also account for them directly. In robustness check, I show that it doesn't really matter if you omit this. And then the main outcomes of interest are different measures of agricultural productivity or different types of crop yield. And the data set, it's at the district level. And then I have essentially data from 1982 to 2015, but except the middle years where I'm missing data. And then all the analysis, I essentially I cluster the standard errors at the allospatial correlation up to 500 kilometers, and then and serial correlation at the district level. So this is kind of the main table where again I examine.
Sorry, so you said a bit about the correlates of resettlement by area within an area. Oh, what was the process for selecting who was?
Like who they selected within a district. So yeah, so part of the official criteria was that at least there would be people who are working age adults, and that generally those who were landless, so that they could well, because they were trying to address this lack of land at the original locations, but there's a lot of evidence that those criteria were not followed. People were essentially being picked up from famine relief centers, and sometimes people who went to a different town to get aid were essentially being picked up, rounded up, and relocated. And so yeah, so while the goal was to resettle people who are of working age adults who could reasonably succeed in the destination locations, it's not clear whether that was followed. And which is why kind of when you see like here, right, they seem very similar. The people who were the origin population and those that were moved tend to be very similar in many characteristics. Okay. And so this is the main result where, again, I look at the effect of the intensity of resettlement on different measures of yield. Cereals are the main crops in Ethiopia. Yeah.
So seeing you have different crops.
Yes.
Did you try looking at matching between origin crop and destination crops?
So this is looking at just purely what's happening in the origin locations, right? Like, so what happens to the origin location when you send people out, or like when a greater share of people are sent out? So.
But what about like whether the skills that people left match the destination locations?
That would be important if I was looking at the outcomes in the destination locations, right? So in fact, thank you for all the analysis. I actually in the baseline I exclude destination locations because they're treated. So the comparison is mainly either those that were origin locations or where there was no resettlement activity at all. Partly because of the its potential effect on the destination locations. But I also show it's robust to adding the destination locations. And so the results imply that essentially 1 percentage point increase in the share of the out-resettled population results in about 3.5% increase in productivity. And I also use an event study design to look at the kind of the trends. Again, so this provides cautious support for the identifying assumption, but it's only one treatment effect. And this seems to be a persistent effect that's kind of declining over time. So in the interest of time, I'll just briefly tell you essentially some of the robustness check that I've done. As I said, there was these arbitrary centrally imposed quotas at the district level. So I use that quota as an instrument for the actual out-resettlement intensity, and the results are similar. And the main measures, I use the crop yield data, but that's limited because I don't have data for the years between 1984 and 1994. And so I use NDVI to proxy for agricultural productivity, which is available for all those years, and the results are similar. So the results are also similar if you use, kind of exploit only the extensive margin variation or specify the treatment in logs. or considering alternative sample restrictions where either exclude destination districts or include destination districts or consider particular provinces. And I also account for potential additional correlates of out-resettlement that I considered in the that were potentially relevant at baseline, as well as a bunch of additional post-resettlement interventions and changes, for example, like changes in access to banking services or extension services, which we may be concerned could be correlated with historical resettlement intensity and have an effect on the outcomes of interest. I could show you some of this, but I don't know how we're doing on time. Okay. Sorry, we have time? Okay. Well, depending on your questions, I'll come back to some of them. So there's a consistent essentially evidence that the out-resettlement resulted in improvements and relative improvements in agricultural productivity. And so what explains these gains in productivity? So if you look at kind of the heterogeneous effects by different baseline characteristics, so here I'm looking at essentially the what potentially explains the gains in productivity. The gains tend to be larger in areas where farmers had small land holding, kind of consistent with the land access issue that I mentioned at baseline. Also with areas that always farm during Belg. So Belg is the second farming season in Ethiopia. So these are the places essentially that are using their land more intensely. And it also the places with less access to farm implements, which was the extent of mechanization back then in Ethiopia, they also tend to benefit more. Yes.
Can you tried it controlling for like plot area? Because could it just be an economies of scale effect?
Possibly, right? That's one potential channel that the resettlement by increasing land holdings, but I'll show you, could be facilitating land consolidation that allows for potentially more productive.
You said you had plot level data sometimes, so I wonder if you could, directly test for that by throwing in a control for average plot size.
So I don't have that for the pre-treatment years. It's only for since 1995. For pre-treatment years, I only see at the district level. I only have district level data. Yeah. And so in general, the gains in productivity seem to be larger for places or regions where land access at baseline was a potential concern, and that we're using their land more intensely. And then for districts with lower access to farm implements, where perhaps due to the lower scale of production, also tend to benefit more. And so the results kind of suggest that it's the improvements in yield may be due to the resettlement easing population pressures on land constrained areas and facilitating a land distribution. And then so there's some evidence that seems additional evidence that seems consistent with that. So here I'm looking at the persistent effects on population distribution. So I'm using the census data from 84, 94, and 2007, which are unfortunately the last three censuses, the only censuses we have. And here I'm looking at what happens to the population of the sending locations, original locations. And the last three columns, I'm looking at the destination location, right? So both of them are consistent. So places where a greater share of people were out resettled have persistently lower population now. On the other hand, the destination locations have more people. Right? These are the receiving locations. And not only that, I could also look at the kind of the ethnic composition of people in the destination locations. The destination locations tend to have a greater share of population belonging to the ethnicities that were resettled, right? And so this shows that the resettlement did have a persistent effect in changing the distribution of population in the country. And then here I look at whether that had an effect on land distribution and fragmentation. In terms of a number of landholdings, I don't have it for the pre-treatment years, so which is why the last three columns here you exploit only the cross-sectional variation. But I could look at landholding sizes using the same design. And what I see is that in the original location, essentially the share of farmers with less than 0.5 holding decreases, whereas there's an increase in the share of farmers with this kind of middle and higher landholding ranges, right? So this could be both because the resettlement may have facilitated reallocation of land in the original location. It could also partly be due to changes in the composition of who was sent out. As I said, unfortunately, I don't have data on the land holdings of the individuals that were sent out, but both of them could be consistent with this. In fact, there's anecdotal evidence that the government had actually prevented the resettled from returning to their origin locations. And about 14% tried or attempted to return to their origin locations. People actually use the word defected because they were preventing and they had potential penalties from leaving the destination location. And often the reason why they wanted to go back was essentially to regain their land. And by the time they returned, a lot of them found that their land had been already reallocated to the people who had stayed behind. Right?
Sorry,
Yes.
can I ask you one question on this land?
Yeah.
There are some research on land misallocation in agriculture in Africa that they say that the land markets are very distorted, right? There are many rules, sometimes there are places that someone tells who to. Do you think that could be a sort of a mechanism there, either distorting what you find or explaining eventually?
Yes, so and that's in fact that's the root of why there was high population densities, because of the absence of land markets. It was outlawed, so people were not able to sell or lease their land, and so which meant that they couldn't out-migrate or they couldn't reallocate land prior to this resettlement. Right? Yeah. Okay. And so we find evidence that the resettlement resulted in kind of persistent changes in population reallocation, and it seems to have increased land holdings. And this also shows that there is a reduction in the number of fields, so potentially could have lessened land fragmentation as well. And so then here I look at how the resettlement affected land use. And I find that in the origin locations or origins with high out-resettlement density, the percentage of cultivated area decreases, whereas following increases. So again, this would be potentially consistent with the increased land consolidation that's allowing for potentially more sustainable land use. And consistent with that, you see reductions in land degradation. And so here I'm looking at the percentage of land cover that's either barren or trees or under short vegetation. There is a decline in the share of the area that's barren, and there's an increase in vegetation. This could potentially include crop fields as well, or essentially area that's left fallow to recover. So in combination, the results suggest that essentially the out-resettlement by easing population pressure in the origin location may have facilitated land distribution in a manner that allowed for more sustainable land use. And overall, I find that essentially the agricultural productivity in the origin location increases, particularly in the areas with greater out-resettlement. The effects are much larger in areas that were substantially constrained in terms of land access, which was eased by this resettlement program. However, as I said from the beginning, the full welfare effects of the resettlement are actually very complex. A resettlement has potentially imposed substantial non-monetary cost on the resettled as well as the host communities. Ramato, for example, estimates that about 14% of settlers died and about 5.5 left resettlement destinations right after they arrived. So this, and many also died, unfortunately, during transit. So there's a huge human cost associated with this resettlement, particularly because it was done in the middle of the famine. It may have also resulted in land dispossession. And then thinking about kind of the what's happening in the destination locations, there is an increase in the amount of area that's cultivated, consistent with like the influx of people in these areas, but there's no effect on productivity, which there's no reason to expect that it would have an effect on productivity in the destination location. And furthermore, I have actually another work looking at the kind of the long run impacts of this program in the destination locations. Because of the nature of how the resettlement was done, it ended up bringing people of different ethnic groups to ethnic homelands of other groups. At the time, the government was not attentive to this. It was a communist regime. But since then, Ethiopia has transitioned into an ethnic federalism where ethnic tensions and divisions have become a lot more salient. And I find that just focusing on the destination locations, the resettlement destinations experience increased incidents of conflict, particularly targeting civilians who are likely to be the settlers during the period since 2015 when ethnic salience became a lot more heightened in Ethiopia. And so the full kind of welfare effects would have to take into account kind of what's happening both in the origin and destination location. Yeah.
So what's the relationship between out resettlements and in resettlements? Is there, are there districts that send only?
Yes.
And districts that receive only, or is it that one district is more active in both?
At the district level, it's almost descending areas and they're mutually exclusive. So this is this, these are the descending areas and these are the destination areas. So, in terms of ethnic composition, there is some overlap. Most of the resettled came from Amhara, particularly Wallo province, and as well as Tigray. And then they were sent, some of them were sent within kind of broadly Amhara region, particularly in Gojam, but a lot of them were sent into Oromia and Gambela and to essentially ethnic homelands of other groups.
Have data on crop prices?
Uh,
Happen locally?
yes. I haven't looked at that, but the challenge has been getting data from prior to, so I essentially use the interlibrary loan to get the books from 1982 and 83 and then digitize them by hand. And I could only get 6 of them. So if you have any idea on how to get, where is this? How to get any of these books for the remaining set, I would greatly appreciate it. Other questions?
Yeah, I think, is there, like, there are two mechanisms, right? There's the more like organizational, like land market failure mechanism, and then there's the more geological, like pressure on land deterioration
Yes.
mechanism. And do you have any variation in the land market failures or like frictions that you would have at baseline? Maybe because before the land reforms, things were different, to kind of disentangle or do some decomposition, like understanding how much of the gain comes from the natural versus the economic involved would be very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I can look into it. Yes.
So I also wondered if there was connection between the people who settled out and the people who were remaining, assuming that they were usually parents of the people who were settled out, and that contributed to maybe different different agricultural patterns that contributed to improvements in the agricultural productivity, because maybe earlier they were just growing the same crops that made the land less fertile, and now they were planting different things.
Yes, I can look into it. So you're thinking about like transfer of skills
Yeah.
from the settlers to the origin location? Possibly, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organizers for having included our paper in this fantastic conference. This is joint work with Arthur Bologna, University of Toronto, and Rocco Machiavello, who is sitting there, just here. And I'm particularly pleased to present this work here because this is the first time ever we present this work. So comments and suggestions are particularly welcome at this stage. Okay. I don't really have to convince this crowd that climate change is a global crisis, but its impacts are unevenly distributed both within and across countries. And in particular, the agricultural sectors of low and middle income countries, where most of the consequences from climate stress and rising temperatures. Okay, these risks are actually particularly severe for women who already face constraints to land, mobility, and capital access, for instance. And a nice FAO report which just came out last year shows indeed that on average, across 24 low and middle income countries, women, female head as a household, suffer most of the high income losses from climate stress, in particular heat stress. Okay, at the same time, in this context, cultural norms are quite pervasive. There is a large body of work that has been showing that gender norms in particular have shaped long-run development and female empowerment, in particular in this context. And the common message of this literature is that actually female-friendly cultural norms are actually unambiguously viewed as welfare enhancing. So what we do in this paper, we ask whether these norms always enhance the women ability to adapt to climate change. And the answer is actually not as straightforward, because seemingly inclusive cultural norms can actually impose restrictive expectations on some marginalized group. And this can happen when, for instance, some of these norms impose very narrow definitions of acceptable roles within this group. And so in this paper, we really look at whether these norms can have actually unintended consequences and also exacerbate existing inequalities. Empirically, analyzing this question is challenging because we will need both cross-cultural variation in gender norms, as well as high-resolution data and very detailed data on agricultural activities. And we leverage novel, globally subnational representative data for coffee producers, sorry, and panel data from Uganda to show that in places where norms encourage women participation, okay, in agriculture, the shock actually lead to a persistent increase in female managed plots, and yet productivity, the yields in these plots decline more sharply. And evidence from Uganda shows indeed that this is due to a within household reallocation. So basically, men exit agriculture and women take over more responsibility for additional plot, for plot that are basically declining in productivity. Okay, this paper speaks to very large strands of literature. The first is the growing literature on climate change and agricultural productivity, and here we show that how, at what extent, gender norms interact with the environmental shocks to reinforce these productivity gaps. And the second is the very large literature on gender norms and economic development, which mostly look at how female-friendly cultural norms have improved outcome for women. And we show in this paper the extent to which norms that rigidly assign roles can actually increase exposure to downside risks. So this is the outline talk. I'll begin introducing a very simple conceptual framework, then describe the data, the empirical results, and finally conclude. So the conceptual framework is really meant to emphasize compositional changes to climate shock, as opposed to, let's say, purely technological shocks or direct productivity effects of such shock. And really, the idea is that to analyze that when basically these norms prescribe agriculture as the main domain for women, it's costly for them to leave the sector despite the decline in productivity. And so we model this as a super simple drawing model of regional choice, where basically each individual has an ability A and land quality Q, and non-farm income in such a setting is given by YG, where theta captures the effects of general gender norms. I'll be more precise on this later on, while lambda is the productivity effect of non-farm income. Farm income is given by YF, where Q again is the land quality. Theta F is captures the effect of this set of specific agricultural norms, and lambda is the productivity of the sector, okay, the agricultural sector. So here, individual will choose farming when YF is greater than 1G, okay, very simple. And this gives us the ability threshold A star, and which determines basically the selection into farming, right? So basically here, when A is greater than A star, we will have positive selection because essentially farming agriculture will give higher returns respect to the agricultural sector, while the opposite is true when A is lower than A star. Now, suppose a productivity shock, land productivity shock, at this point is a permanent shock that will only affect the agriculture activity by a factor of 1 minus delta, so across the ability distribution. This shock basically reduces the ability threshold A star by this factor and leads us to the first proposition that tells us that sector-specific norms, because the productivity threshold has decreased, these sector-specific norms keep higher ability women in farming post-shock, okay? While general norms have the opposite effect, making the selection more negative. We can also derive a parallel threshold for land quality, Q star, which basically is possibly correlated with the shock delta. And this also leads us to the second proposition that basically emphasizes the role on land quality. And here we have that sector-specific norms concentrate women on lower quality land, while general norms close the general productivity, gender quality, sorry, land quality gap. And the idea here is really that to highlight that cultural norms not only influence whether women farm, but also what they are willing to farm under climate stress. And in particular, when sector-specific norms are pervasive, women might actually be willing to farm lands that are facing declining productivity. Yes, please.
And these agents you have here in mind are female, women, right? Okay. And I know this is sort of toy model to guide empirics, but don't you think these sort of thresholds and all of these decisions should think about the sort of returns to the household, male and female, right? And
so all of these, so in this very simple model, we are just modeling individuals, but all of this applies also to the household level, whereby and indeed I will show you the results when basically the reallocation of labor is within household. Okay.
Because one of your results goes along this, right? You say that it depends on what the male.
I'll show you. I'll show you. Just give me all the slides. So to test these predictions, propositions, we draw on several sources of data. The primary data are drawn from Emeritus, which is an independent non-profit organization that monitors sustainability practices in the coffee sector. And between 2019 and 2021, Emeritus collected very detailed geographic information from over 100,000 farmers in 15 of the most important coffee producing countries. These are repeated cross-section surveys with very, very detailed information on inputs, outputs, plot characteristics, and most importantly, the ownership of the farm and also the management. Right. Beyond data availability, let me also stress that coffee is a particularly useful crop for comparative analysis because it essentially has a very standardized technology of production, where basically most of the cherries are selectively picked by hand. And so it is basically comparison across different contexts and also the measurement of physical productivity. We combine each of these point with cultural norms from the ethnographic class, distinguishing between general norms that are, let's say, good for women overall, so they promote women empowerment overall, and sector-specific gender norms that are instead norms that basically push women into the agricultural sector. Okay, and we follow the literature in this, mostly Alesina and Couters and Julian and Nunn, and identify sector-specific norms as plow versus non-plow society, where plow societies were basically the use of pre-industrial plow on the societies were preventing women from field work due to physical constraints, while non-plow societies such as home cultivation were more female-friendly. And we also have an additional metric which basically measures female participation in agriculture in pre-industrial societies on a 5-point scale. While general norms in our context are, again, more general norms overall, not just in the agricultural sector, such as matrilineal, equal inheritance, and marriage rights. Then, to validate and extend our findings, we complement what we have in the global coffee data with the Uganda National Panel Survey, the UNPS, which is a high-frequency survey conducted by UBOS, Uganda Bureau of Statistics, and we follow Doug Gollin and Trisuri in focusing on 4 waves spanning the period 2019 to 2014 to track approximately 2,700 households. So a key advantage of this UMPS lies in its plot level panel structure, which allows us to track basically the same plot over the different waves, as well as the changes in management of this plot. And also, unlike the Enveritas data, in the UMPS data, we have multiple crops beyond coffee, mainly staples. So this allows us to check whether our results generalize to other sectors as well. One limitation, though, is that at least in Uganda, we cannot really exploit the cross-cultural variation in gender norms, because like 98% of respondents here are in ethnic groups that are basically female-friendly, that have female-friendly norms. Please.
I'm wondering if within the sector-specific gender norms, you have something around the cattle raising, and because I have in mind that cattle can be more resilient to climate shocks, and maybe in some cultures.
Yeah. In this specific preliminary analysis, we only focus on two sector-specific norms, plough versus non-plough societies, because it also applies to the coffee agriculture sector, and whether let's say the role of female was kind of keen or in the agriculture sector in a way. We didn't look precisely into livestock or cattle, but that's something that it would be interesting to look at. Yes, thank you. And lastly, of course, for the shock, we combine all of this information with theories of daily presentation from chips and match each of these equations with each location country, growing season, because this is the relevant period for the agricultural shock in our setting, the standard SPI measure. The only picture that I wanted to show you today is this one, where on the left-hand side panel, we show that female ownership is quite heterogeneous across different countries. On average, we have that 30% of coffee plantations are managed by women, but this varies widely, like from more than 40% in Rwanda to just less 4% in Brazil. And these female farmers are actually, on average, 9% less productive than male counterparts. This, of course, might reflect several constraints, including access to credit or land or whatever you have in mind. But I wanted just to think about it, like to better understand how gender interacts with the broader agricultural constraints here. And in terms of our empirical strategy, as mentioned, we exploit cross-cultural variation in gender norms, as well as different drought exposure, to analyze the productivity gaps, as well as the compositional changes. And so we proceed in two steps. In the first step, we have the productivity gaps, where we control for both the past and the current drought, where the current drought captures the whether there's been any extreme drought in the current growing season, while the interacted with female, and the past drought captures whether there's been any extreme drought occurring in that specific location during the past 5 growing season, excluding current growing season. So basically, beta 1, which is our coefficient of interest, captures this medium run gender differences in post-shock, right? While the beta 4, so current drought, really helps us in isolating these from transitory productivity shock in a way. Yes.
Clarify, why do you need 30 years of rainfall data if your surveys they start in 2009, don't they?
Yeah, to compute the shock, because these are basically anomalies from the downtrend. Yeah, this is a standard way of computing the shock. Basically, yes, I can come back to this. For compositional changes, we look at whether the farm is managed by female or by a male. And here, what I wanted to stress is that in our setting, really the main adjustment is labor reallocation, because coffee is a perennial crop. it's a tree that takes 3 to 4 years to become profitable. So basically, switching across crops, it has really high fixed cost, and it's rarely available options for farmers when the shock hits. So household here or individuals may only decide to allocate their labor to the coffee plantation this season, or postpone it, delay it after better conditions return, right? And essentially, we compute both of these in 2 different cultural contexts: general gender norms and sector-specific norms. Okay. Starting from the general gender norms results and the productivity gaps, we find here that the productivity gaps, so the drug-induced gender productivity gaps for female, are larger in unfavorable places, that are those places in which female are, have less norms like matrimony, marriage, or inheritance in the favor. And in particular, when looking at the favorable places, the interaction term is not is smaller and not even significant, indicating that in this context, women are at least as good as men in coping with the shock. Then, when we look at the sector-specific gender norms, the results show a surprising reverse. Okay. So in places with favorable gender norms, sector-specific gender norms, the productivity gaps are higher, actually. Okay, while the opposite is not really true in unfavorable places. Then we look at the compositional responses of drought, and we find that the number of farms managed by women increased by approximately 3.5 percentage point, but only in places with female-friendly sector-specific norms. And actually, these results are quite stable across both norm definitions, whether the plow was absent or whether this was a place with the female-friendly agricultural norms, and are also quite stable if you include a host of household and let's say plot level controls. However, these findings don't yet explain the mechanisms that are behind these results. So we are really interested in understanding whether women are taking over responsibility for declining productivity plots, or are really as good as men in managing these plots. So it's really a matter of ability or land quality. And we provide suggestive evidence with the global coffee data. It's actually the former, that is, women are taking over additional responsibility for this land, which already face declining productivity due to the shock. And in particular, what we show here is that we confirm the results that we have previously shown, that is, after the shock, the size of the land managed by women increase, okay, but only in places with sector-specific norms. And then in column 3 and 5, we report the results for whether that particular plantation was using a depulper or a mill on site. These are both long-term investment. And what we show here is that in these places, women are less likely to operate a depulper or a mill on site, which already shows somehow, that they are operating on a lower quality coffee plantations. However, to better identify this mechanism, I will turn to the Ugandan data, which for which we can exploit, the within household and more demanding fixed effects in particular. And indeed, the first results are on within household reallocation, land management, and in particular, we can here include more demanding fixed effects, such as household plot and parcel fixed effects, to understand whether this labor reallocation is really across households or within households. And what we show here is that this is across, within household, and in particular, after the shock, the number of female managed plots increased by approximately 2 percentage points, which is relatively smaller, but in the very similar range of what we have seen for the global coffee data, which were about like 3.5 percentage points. Then moving to the gender gaps in Uganda, in the first column, we replicate the specification we have worked for the global coffee data that is only using cross-sector variation. And we still, again, find this, let's say, large gender productivity gaps after shock of approximately 9%, which is, again, very much consistent with what we found in the global data. But then, again, we can use more demanding fixed effects to understand whether this is an issue of, ability of the farmer, of the women, or a quality of the land they are taking over responsibility. And from column 2 to 4, we again include household plot and parcel fixed effects. So the idea here is to compare men and women on the very same land, on the very same plot in different points in time. So we fix the quality of the land, and we land the land, and we let the ability of the farmer to vary. And here, basically, the gender productivity gaps disappear. And when instead we have similar specification, but we fix the ability of the farmer and let the land of the quality to vary, the gender gaps emerge. And this, again, indicates that these women are really taking over this additional responsibility within household for these decreasingly profitable plots, okay, after the shock. Well, we have a...
Can I ask you something
Sure.
on this?
Yeah.
Because you stressed a few times that these women are taking over responsibility on these plots that have decreasing over time yields, right?
Yes.
Due to this climate shock. But in your specification, your climate shock is one random dry season, right? You're not exploiting these long differences, right? That some plots are becoming over the entire panel window less suitable to agriculture, right? What identifies your on your panel structure is just one drier season. So there could be a better one later on, right? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I'll have to think about it. But
Let's discuss this,
but
yes.
one thing that I can mention is that we always control for each crop for the suitability of that particular crop with the standard FAO guides data. So this might somehow
I
answer
don't think so, but let's elaborate. on
Okay,
this.
okay. Let me
No, sure.
These results are robust to a bunch of checks, including placebo for future droughts, alternative definitions of yields and shocks, whether we include country trends, and then for spatial correlation. But let me conclude because I'm running out of time. So in this paper, we'll ask whether cultural norms that favor women improve their ability to adapt to climate change. And what we show is that when norms are sector specific, that is, those norms that associate women with agriculture, they can limit rather than expanding women economic choices. And in particular, this is a result of women that are more likely to manage land after the drought, but only in places where these agricultural norms historically assign them responsibility for farming. And thank you. We have time for
left, if you
Okay.
for a few questions.
Do you have an idea how the results change if you condition on income?
Yeah, so unfortunately, in the global coffee data, we don't have income and not even a proxy for that. What we have is that we could have a proxy for wealth. We can construct from the different assets the farmers have a proxy for wealth. We have tried that, but the symbol literally shrinks by a lot. I don't have a precise answer of that stuff.
Are the norms here considered to be completely fixed?
Yeah.
Because presumably over time, as different sectors emerge which favor males or females, the norms will change, right?
Yes.
The norms from 1967.
Yeah, all of these norms are computed in let's say, measured in the pre-industrial era. So in a sense, they are fixed, yes.
Is there any
Don't
evidence?
really evolve over time.
Is there any evidence of whether they remain fixed or have they been changing?
Usually in response to the
Yeah. It sort of looks like women are being pushed into less attractive work in places with particular norms, but
So the general idea is that basically in places with general female-friendly
Yeah.
norms, in a sense, women follow comparative advantages. Okay, while the opposite is true for sex-specific norms. I don't have evidence that these norms might change over time, especially in such a relatively small period of time, in 3 years of time. But it's something that it might warrant a discussion for sure. Yes, thank you. Yes.
A little bit related to this and on the household reallocation, is there any way to get at anything about what the men end up doing after these shocks? To this point that they, are they staying unemployed? Do they move into cities for urban work? And to what extent that differs by these different countries with different norms?
Yeah, we can't say much on that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we would love to have, data that says men are leaving or exiting the agricultural sector for, pursuing of farm work or in the service sector. We can say.
The Uganda survey is just for the farm.
Yes, these are all agricultural surveys that, only capture agricultural activities and that would really, help us a lot in explaining the mechanism that we have in mind, but yeah, unfortunately not. Not available.
In the Uganda survey, is there heterogeneity in the share of women working in agriculture at baseline that may be endogenous because it's not the norms from Murdoch, but could that give you some additional suggestive evidence that could you leverage this heterogeneity?
Yes, definitely. We thought about that, but it's still pretty much work in progress. But yes, the idea was to really use the share of women based on opinion and see whether this evolves over time or not. Yes, but yes, I will be completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe this isn't in your data as well, but just related to that, do you have any idea of what women were doing beforehand? Were they working in other sectors or were they not working?
No, unfortunately, we can't tell that as well.
It'd be interesting because it kind of changes, like if it's goes from not working to working.
Yeah. No. So within the global coffee data, we can only tell whether. So we only have data on coffee plantations. So we can only tell whether men or female, the location of labor on that particular coffee plantations. We don't know. We don't have any evidence on whether these are exiting agriculture at all or just excluding any other agricultural activity, unfortunately.
I'll cut off any more questions, but we have a short break now, so you can keep talking there, and we'll be back at 2:30 for the keynote.
And Rocco is there, so I encourage you to chase me.
So now we can hear.
Hi, Bart, can you hear us? Talk something to you. We cannot hear him. Bart, can you try saying something? Let's go. We cannot hear him.
No, we cannot hear you. Yeah, no, and that's,
Okay.
like I was talking to you about lens.
Sorry, I can hear 5 different voices at the same time, so I cannot know. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. Tell us, there's people who talk. Might get a bit of a mess.
Perfect. Thank you. But there's a lot of noise. I don't know. It seems like many microphones are turned on because I can hear many voices.
What about you?
I'm from India. I come from an agricultural family. Yeah.
Like your parents?
My grandparents. Okay.
Sure.
And then my parents became doctors.
Bart, do you want to try sharing your slides?
Dad went back after the
Hear me?
yeah,
sharing
and
your
that's
Okay.
what so he's doing
Yeah.
so we have so it's interesting, which is why like that's where I got the question from as well. Some transfer that happens.
That would be cool, yeah.
presentations. So that's up to you. An outreach or? Yeah, no, so the entire session should last an hour. Yeah. I don't know, Giles, how long, Bart, how long did you plan to?
Um, 20 or 30 minutes. What do you prefer?
Yeah, so I think in general, maybe like 30 minutes, 25 minutes. And then some discussion.
Which again gives that break.
I don't know. For some reason, I hear very many different voices at the same time. So it's difficult to.
I'll go.
When several people are talking at the same time, it's difficult.
Yeah, sorry, Bart. It's just it's still a break, so there's a lot of people talking at the moment. Hopefully, it's a lot better for you once everyone quiets down in a few minutes.
But did you say 20 or 30 minutes?
Sorry?
How many minutes should I aim for in the presentation?
So about 25. Aim for 25 minutes.
25.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay.
For like.
Do you see the slides?
I'm going to
Yes,
first.
we can see the slides.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Bard, I have a, sorry, this is the chair, Giles Atkinson. Nice to meet you. I just had a quick question about how you want to be introduced, because there's quite a few bits of Stanford that you're affiliated to, and different titles and so on. So, particular one you want me to refer to? You're based.
I'm based here. I'm in LSE. I'm doing my post-graduation.
Right.
So I went here for 1 year.
I think I'm sorry, it's a bit complicated, and they have all this long title in the US. So it's supposed to be the David Lobel Professor in Business and Environment at the Stanford School of Graduate School of Business, and I'm also professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability.
Okay.
Hi.
Sorry, you don't need to do it, I guess.
I don't remember being here.
Bard, hi, this is Labana. I'm telling about your travel. I just want to double check. Do you want me to book anything for you, or are you organized?
And
I think I will take the 7 a.m. flight tomorrow morning.
they had just acquired this building as well.
Do you want me to book that, or you'll book that yourself?
So yeah,
I can do it. I can do it.
No problem, just send me the details after. Thank you.
you just have the old building.
By the way, this is nice.
It's
It's okay.
Yeah.
Doing the breaks.
It's not showing always running the live stream,
Please,
but we can meet ourselves.
Maybe
We might have
It was like
if you don't mind, we'll mute yourselves and we'll check in with you
Okay. See you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Could we make a start in a moment, please? Thank you, and a big welcome to you all for this keynote lecture session on biodiversity. My name is Giles Atkinson. I'm a professor of environmental policy at LSE. I'm also the acting director of Cranford Research Institute at the moment. So I'm delighted to be able to chair this session as part of Environment Week. We have two fantastic speakers in this session, plus a wonderful discussant as well. We're going to start with a talk by Professor Bard Harstad. Bard is the David S. Lobel Professor in Business and Sustainability and Professor of Political Economy at Stanford University, where he's a member of the Dewar School of Sustainability and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And sorry, Bard, if I forgot any other Stanford affiliations that you have. But let me hand over to Bard now, who will speak to us for around about 25 minutes on the economics of conservation. Thank you very much in advance, Bard.
We can't hear you.
Thank you so much for introducing me. I'm trying to find. Let me see. I should share those slides, which I hope you see now. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yeah. So I would love to be there. I'm extremely sorry that I'm not there in person, and I hope to be there in person very, very soon. What I will talk about is the economics of conservation. I will talk a little bit about it. It's a big question or a big topic because when I refer to the economics of conservation, I define it as the economics of doing nothing, which is a bit different from what we are doing studying in most of the economics. We know how to do nothing, but I think that this solution of doing nothing or not extracting resources or leaving things in the ground or leaving trees standing in a forest, that as a solution is becoming increasingly important for many environmental problems. But when I try to study this, there are a few problems. And every time I'm thinking, and also some of my scholars, fellow colleagues are thinking about solutions, there are other problems that arises as a replacement problem. One problem that I will talk about now is the problem that arises if the North, who could compensate the South for conserving forest, is not time consistent. I will then talk about problems that arise if the South, who could receive compensation and conserve nature because of that, if the South is not time consistent. And then I will talk about how these time inconsistencies might not only be a problem, but something we can try to exploit, in the sense that we can get more conservation per dollar. If you have time, I will even think about and talk about how the gains from trade, like trade agreements, can be exploited so that we can obtain more conservation because of it. So let me start with the kind of what I call problem zero, because it's a problem which you know very, very well. It's just about externalities. So just think about the setting where a country in the South, it could be Brazil or any other countries, I call it S, benefits some amount, say B, from logging or deforesting or allowing the forest to be cleared for agricultural purposes. But there's a cost of doing that, and some of this cost is experienced abroad by other countries, and that's by an externality. That cost is C for a country, say N. We can, of course, think about many countries. Then, of course, the obvious solution is that maybe the North can compensate the South for not logging, because S can then get some kind of compensation, say P, And for the Brazil proposal, TFFF, there is a fixed number for what this price could be. If B, if the benefit of logging B is smaller than the cost for the North C, then it should be possible to find a number P in between, so that if the North pays P to the South for not conserving, for not extracting the forest or allowing the forest to be deforested, then both parties will benefit. So a very extremely simple game tree, which we will expand very soon, can be the following one. The South has a decision about whether to log or not, and if nothing is done, then the payoffs are normalized to 0. If the South does decide to log, there is a benefit B going to the South, and there is a cost C, which is therefore a benefit minus C to the North. And to avoid that cost, the North has an incentive to pay a price P to the South before the South decides to log. Then that will be a cost for the North, who is the first player in this little game, and that will be a benefit for the South. So if P is between B and C, both parties benefit, and that is also the equilibrium in the game. Like the South is going to log given the chance, but therefore North is going to pay to avoid minus C and B as payoffs. So of course, this solution is sometimes called PES, or Payment for Ecosystem Services, in this particular context. It's very similar to also what we refer to as a RED+, or reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation. And clearly, it's a special case of the Coase theorem, where the Coase theorem predicts and describes how two parties, like NNS, can solve an externality problem with payments and compensations. Of course, this is a too simple game, because in reality, you don't have two stages, but the time is going on. It's a much more complicated game, and we can expand it just a little bit by describing this bigger game tree here. So now the North has the chance to pay, South can log, but if that does not happen, the game continues. The North can continue to pay another time, and if that does not happen, the South can log, and if that does not happen either, the game will continue, because the forest will still be conserved, but no payment has taken place, which commits S to conserve. So now the game is a little bit more complicated, because if the South thinks and suspects and hopes that the North will pay next time, then if that payment is large enough and larger than and that discounted is larger than B, then the South will conserve, because the South will then prefer the conservation compensation P instead of the benefit B it can get from deforesting. So if the South believes the North will pay, S does not log. Of course, if that is the decision of South, that the South will not log, then at the beginning, North will not bother to pay. There's no point to pay S if S is going to conserve anyway. So this creates basically a cycle in the best responses. If it's not credible that N will pay ever, then the South will be better off logging to get B. But if that is going to happen, the North will indeed pay, contradicting what we started out with as an assumption. So it looks like a contradiction, but if you think about it, the equilibrium of this game must be in mixed strategies. It must be so that the South might log and the North might pay, but with some chance the North will not pay, and therefore the South will deforest. So there is no equilibrium where this basically get the Coase solution and conservation with certainty. So this is clearly a problem. And to solve this, it's really, we can think about alternative solutions, but clearly one solution would occur if the North had a commitment that it would pay at some point in time in the future. But the problem is more complicated than this, because there are many northern countries. It's not only one northern country who could benefit from conservation. There are many. And this means that for all those northern countries, the conservation of this piece of nature is essentially a public good. All of them would benefit as long as one of them pays for conserving the forest. And therefore, there is an incentive to free ride. And if you then solve this game again and think about what is now the solution of this game, then there is a stronger incentive for one of them to wait. Because before, the risk was that if you wait, the south might cut. But now there is also a benefit of waiting, because if you wait, maybe another northern countries will make the compensation instead. So that means that you have a stronger incentive to wait and to make it an equilibrium. But it cannot be an equilibrium that you wait with certainty, because the south will then cut. And if south cuts, one of the northern countries will be better off making the payment. So the equilibrium must be in mixed strategies, but to make one of the countries willing to pay in that case, even if there's a benefit of waiting, hoping to free ride, it must be the case that the south is more likely to log if you do not pay. So that means that even if you have many, or especially if you have many northern countries who all benefit, then the first best, of course, implies that it becomes more important to conserve, and in a more complicated model, you will get more conservation because of the larger number of members or countries who would benefit from conservation. But what happens in equilibrium is the opposite. You get more logging because of this free rider problem. So that's the second problem. A third problem, which I would like to mention before we brainstorm about solutions, is that it's something I call a conservation multiplier, and that relates to the fact that not only the North or the northern government might have a problem by committing itself to future payments, but the South might also have a timing consistency problem. One of the reasons for that is that the government today might be different from the government later. So even if the South would like to promise to conserve, I would like to stick on a path with sustainable management of the forest, it's difficult to commit and tie your hands to that path. And then there is a problem, because the government in 2029 might not only be different so that you cannot influence what those decisions will be, but maybe those governments will also use their revenues, which it gets from, for example, getting payments from agriculture or something, to things which the current government value less. So they might have different different preferences for what the revenues should be used for. And in those settings, it will be the case, and that's very intuitive, that if a future government is expected to log, then today or earlier, it becomes less attractive to conserve. Because what's the point of conserving today if the next government is going to extract and use some of the revenues on things which you are not valuing? So therefore, the consequence might be that also the current government or the earlier government will also log. This can lead to some kind of domino effect, where no one conserves, even if everyone would be better off if everyone conserved. So just a small probability in the future that someone will log can lead to basically unraveling and a lot of logging already today. But there is also, of course, the opposite situation can also work. Like, so if the North here, if you bring back the North, if the North can make it credible that it would compensate for conservation also in the future, then basically there will be a domino effect, which is now positive in the sense that the more it's likely to be conserved in the future by the government because of these compensations, the more the government in, say, 2033 will also conserve, because it's more valuable to conserve when that is not going to end 4 years later. And then likewise in 2029, the government will be more inclined to conserve when they expect that this effort is going to continue thanks to the donors' payment sometime in the future. So that can lead to a multiplier effect with more conservation today, even if the payment is coming later, as long as it is credible and trustworthy. So one way of illustrating this is that basically the best response level for how much forest or the extraction of any resource really, how that best response depends on the extraction level in the future or the expected extraction level in the future. That will be some kind of increasing function Because intuitively, as I mentioned, if you think that future extraction level will be large, it's less valuable to conserve now. So this will be increasing, and because it increases, we can try to look for a stationary equilibrium where basically this best response curve, which is in blue, crosses the 45-degree line, which is in red dash. And that will be a stationary equilibrium. And if you then change the benefit of conservation, if you increase the benefit of conservation, because the donor is paying for conservation, then the extraction level will shift down. But it will shift down more than the vertical shift. It will shift down not only because of the vertical shift, which will take every future extraction level as given, but it will shift down more in equilibrium down to the point where it again crosses the 45-degree line, because when also future governments are likely to extract less, it becomes more valuable to conserve today. So this is a way basically to exploit the conservation multiplier. This multiplier, yeah, we can. It's naturally likely that it's larger if the rotation of political power is frequent, because that is when you think that you might not be the government in the future, someone else will. And also the multiplier is larger, and this domino effect is larger if there is more disagreement between the parties regarding what the revenues should be spent for. Because then you don't value the fact that maybe the future government will extract the resource and spend money on things if you don't like those particular public goods or local public goods. Also, the multiplier is larger if there's more corruption, because then more of the revenues from deforestation is going into the pocket of the policymakers instead of some local public goods. So we mentioned already that if it's expected that North will pay for conservation in the future, then it can lead to a domino effect with more conservation today. So that's what we call talk about when we talk about exploiting the multiplier. But there is a problem, is that the lobby group who prefers, for example, making forests available for agriculture, will also be able to exploit the multiplier in a similar way. In the sense that if it's expected that the lobby group will pay for extraction and deforestation later, say in 2037, then there's less valuable to conserve in 2033 and in 2029, and you will get more extraction and you will get more land available for agriculture immediately, only because of the expectation that these lobby groups will eventually persuade the government, whoever will be in power at the time, to make the land available for agriculture. So then that will reduce the incentive to conserve now. So the lobby group will then get a lot of extraction for free. And then you can see that both the lobby group and also the North could potentially benefit from this kind of multiplier effect, but there's a big asymmetry between them. It's not a symmetric situation. The asymmetry comes from the following fact. To get basically access to the forest and turn it into agriculture, the lobby group basically only needs to win this game once. Like, you need to persuade one government, thanks to the lobby contributions, to get the land available for agriculture. In contrast, the North, who prefers conservation, it is basically only ensuring that the game never stops. It's just going to continue. The North will have to pay for conservation every time to every government who has the opportunity to make the land available for agriculture. So this is a huge asymmetry in favor of the multiplier of the lobby group, and the equilibrium outcome is not likely to be efficient. It's not like in Grossman-Helpman that if both groups on both sides are organized, the balanced outcome will be relatively efficient. Here there is a asymmetry because one of the players, the North, prefer to continue the game, but the other lobby group prefers to stop the game. And you only need to stop it once, but you need to continue every time. So one thing I'm especially interested in these days regards how this problem can be solved by a financial instrument, which is not of those types we have studied and discussed so far, namely grants. But suppose instead that if the North pays today it is a loan. Suppose that the North can give as a loan now, and that must be repaid only if there is increased logging. So if the next government conserve, the next government will not need to repay the loan, but the loan will still be there, so that if the government in 2030 or 2037 runs a policy which leads to deforestation, then the loan will be due with a high interest rate. So in that sense, that would make it costly for the future government to introduce policies that lead to more deforestation. And accepting this loan today in 2025 is therefore a way for the current government to influence or even tie the hands of future governments. And that is valuable because the South or the government in these governments were suffering from a time inconsistency problem. And this loan helps this government to solve the time inconsistency problem it was facing. And therefore, the current government is basically willing to conserve quite a lot in return for the payment today, but especially if it takes the form of a loan that will influence or tie the hands of future governments. Therefore, you get more conservation per dollar. So this is what this is a little bit similar to. It's not similar to debt for nature swaps because you will never forgive the debt. It's not similar to green bonds because the green bonds do not tie the interest rate to environmental performance. Instead, this is related to something which is called sustainability-linked bonds, which is issued only so far by Chile and Uruguay, and very recently by Thailand. Well, many companies do it, but that's the only countries I'm aware of so far. One challenge with this sustainability-linked bonds or forest-linked loans, as I would call it in this context, could be that it might be difficult to come up with the liquidity. That liquidity problem is not only a problem for forest-linked loans, but also for any large payments that you would like to make in return for conservation of nature. So it might be worthwhile to think about how can you get around the problem that many northern countries, even in Europe, do not have the liquidity that they would like to promise in return for conservation. If you don't have the liquidity, we might need to think about other ways of compensating the South. And there are not that many other things, but international trade and trade agreements is clearly a carrot and it's a beneficial thing for countries, according to most economists. And that would mean that there are gains from trade that can be split between the North and the South in many different ways, depending on the details of the trade agreement. You might remember that this is called the Pareto frontier, and you can travel along it by, for example, adjusting one tariff or one quota of one product. That could be beneficial for the North, less beneficial for the South, and that is why you are still on the Pareto frontier if you do that adjustment. And then you can, and of course, that is why trade agreements takes a while to negotiate, because they negotiate where on this Pareto frontier are they going to be. One possibility is that you start in the green place and end up in the red place, which is less favorable to the South if deforestation increases. So if you could make the trade or the terms of trade or the tariffs contingent on forest cover, then you can make what I call a contingent trade agreement, which can motivate the South to conserve in order to maintain the favorite or the favored terms of trade, which is described by this green type of agreement. If the agreement specifies that if deforestation increases, the tariff on beef going from, say, Mercosur to Europe will increase. That is reducing the gain for the South, but it will actually be beneficial for the North, especially if you take into account some of the political groups that is not today pressuring the government, for example, in France, to impose high tariff on beef coming from abroad. So therefore, this is credible. It's not an empty threat. It's not a threat which says that if say Brazil deforest, you will never trade with them again. That will not be a credible threat. But as long as you are in the Pareto frontier, it is an incredible threat. So I think I should stop. But basically, the obvious solution to the economics of doing nothing is that you need to think about, you start with costs, think about how you can exploit the cost in a solution about compensation. But there are many, many problems. I talked about free rider problems in addition to timing consistency. But I also think I talked about how you can basically exploit domestic timing consistency problems by offering solutions that help the country, say the South, to commit. And in that way, you can get more conservation per dollar. Okay, I need to stop there, I think, but I look forward to any discussion.
Many thanks, Bard, and an absolutely incredible body of knowledge on this topic that you contributed to. So many thanks for distilling that for us. As I mentioned, we do have another keynote speaker in a moment, and we have a discussant, but we have time for a couple of questions before we move on. Would anybody like to ask a question of Bard about his work? Yes.
I was wondering, Bard, how reforestation could enter your framework and whether it could be, if it's a problem or an opportunity for countries to kind of ask for forgiveness and not permission to deforest and then plant trees again?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, that's a very good question. I didn't really talk about the reforestation. In some of these game trees that I described, I had treated the forest as an depletable stock. To some extent it is, because if you value biodiversity and not only carbon, then once biodiversity is lost, it would take a long time to get that biodiversity back. So some of the benefits are perhaps best modeled as an exhaustible resource. But for carbon, for example, it becomes very, very important to also motivate reforestation. And I think that that might be actually a little bit easier, because when the problem that arises when you think about biodiversity, which is lost perhaps forever, is that you can think about solutions, for example, that you will never trade with Brazil again, and those will be empty threats. Because bygones are bygones, and if there is an irreversible decision about deforestation, then it becomes not sub-perfect even to stick with a threat to not trade. But if you think about reforestation, it might be a little bit easier actually to motivate the reforestation, because it doesn't introduce irreversible, the decision will not be irreversible. And you can use similar solutions. For example, when I talk about what I talked about in the end, like about contingent trade agreement, the tariffs can clearly be tied to reforestation levels and not only deforestation levels.
Thank you. Just time for one further. Saw the hand first.
I was wondering about the collective action problems within the group of northern countries, for example, or perhaps even in the southern countries. Like, they also have an incentive to want a free riding problem here, where they would like someone else to pay or someone else to log or someone else not to log. So I was wondering how you sort of see that in this framework of these three different teams.
Right. I think that's an extremely important problem. One can think about, so it's simple to think about the problem, but it's a bit harder to think about solutions. But a few candidates are that you could try to connect it with some type of private benefit, so that if there is a private benefit of making a compensation, then you don't have the same strong incentive to free ride on other countries. One type of private benefit that you could connect it to could be, for example, ecotourism, like the one who pays get the right to have ecotourism, for example, in part of the forest. That may be not always so desirable. A better solution would be that you get credit, right? So if you connect a payment scheme to ETS or emission trading system or a voluntary carbon market, then it's possible for the one who pays to get a credit and therefore the right to emit elsewhere. That is another possibility. A third possibility is that you solve the free rider problem in a regular way with an agreement between the northern countries. So if several countries, for example in Europe, make an agreement that they will all compensate southern countries for conservation, they will both be able to maybe address the free rider problem, but it will also help them to commit to future compensation. And I started out by talking about the timing consistency problem that North faces. It would like to compensate or promise compensation in the future, but it's very attractive to just postpone that if the South will conserve anyway. But by having a treaty between several northern countries, it might be more, it might be possible for them to make future compensations credible. And that is one interpretation of several international agreements, is that it can help countries to commit because it can increase the cost, for example, by sanctions from other countries if they do not stick to those pledges.
Thank you very much. We probably should move on. John, are you okay with waiting for your question? Hopefully there'll be time at the end as well. So let me thank Bard once more. Now to introduce our second keynote speaker, who is Giuliano Sunsao. Giuliano is an associate professor in the Department of Economics in the Pontifical Catholic University Rio de Janeiro. He is also the executive director of the Brazil Climate Policy Initiative. And Giuliano will talk to us about restoring the forest climate link strategy for COP30 and beyond. So rather than the economics of doing nothing, it's going to be the economics of doing something with the tree. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity and invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure to see so many faces that I haven't been seen for a while. And this work is connecting some of the research that I've been doing along with Jose Schenkman, Lars Hansen, and Todd Manson, and with some discussions that we've been exploring in the context of COP30. And this is the kind of message that I'd like to deliver here is probably in two different layers. In the broader sense is the idea that the forest can play a role as part of the solutions portfolio in terms of addressing climate change. And second, we can think about for a specific way in which this connection will happen, that will also channel significant resources to forests and to conserve biodiversity and so on and so forth. So I'm going to try to organize the talk around these two topics, right? With a broad view about the climate forest nexus, and then talking about a specific way of creating incentives for moving forward and taking into account the discussions in this particular moment. So let me start with why should we care about forests, right? And there are different ways that we can, even considering a more kind of a utilitarian perspective on forests, there are different layers of functions of services that the forest can play, from biodiversity, carbon dynamics. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about water and climate regulation, how forests can contribute to that piece as well, as long as some social and development benefits, especially for the traditional peoples that lives and depends upon the forest, right? So there are many reasons to think about forests. And today I'm going to focus on the carbon side because this is an angle for which we can really connect with another big problem that we're trying to deal with, which is climate, right? And talking about these forest climate nexus, there are different ways or points of contact between these two different agendas, right? If you look at forests, there are three different specific issues that are related, but at the same time, they are different in nature. The first one is about the amount of the forest area that we have. And if you consider tropical and subtropical forests, they stretch over 91 countries and comprising an area of 1.27 million hectares, in which we can estimate that we have some almost 600 gigatons of CO2, which is equivalent to 1/3 of the historical global emissions. So from that perspective, it's a big asset, it's a big threat, in a sense. So this is more, this consider the areas that are under threat and areas that are not under threat of deforestation, right? The marginal and inframarginal. So this is the stock. And then there are two kinds of flows associated with forests, right? The first one is the deforestation. We still observe in tropical areas a significant deforestation. According to the Hansen data, we have something around 10 million hectares of deforestation every year in the last 10 years, right? Which is still significant, although we have the global agricultural area associated to production is declining, if anything, right, over this period. And so this is a kind of a negative flow in terms of losing biodiversity, forest loss and losing carbon, right? But in areas that were deforested, especially between 2001 and 2003, in which you have more detailed data, we can estimate that there are the opportunity of, implementing forest restoration at scale, basically relying on natural regeneration, which is something that happens more easily, especially in the tropical forests. There are in some areas that we have more specific data. We do observe significant amounts of secondary vegetation there. The biodiversity is not as it was before, but from a carbon perspective, things are significantly good. And according to our estimates, based on the same procedure that we use in our paper, we apply to this whole set of countries. We come up with this number of 49 gigatons of CO2 that can be captured in these areas that were deforested. So it's something that it's not gonna put us in a safe place in terms of the climate change, but it can have a kind of significant contribution, especially in a world in which we are failing so much with the mitigation strategy, right? So talking about carbon removals in the context that we are still increasing emissions, I think it's particularly important. The forest can be a part of that. So this will establish a kind of a two-way avenue. From the one hand, what you have is that, if we better integrate forest as part of the climate solutions portfolio, this will enhance the protection of those carbon stocks. And we would also benefit from these large-scale carbon removals, right? So this would, help us deal with this climate, the climate problem in which, the emissions here in the dark, in black, they are not going in the right directions. And you think about the place that you should be in terms of considering the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, things are not looking that great. Even if we consider the best case scenario for the so-called NDCs, which are the commitments associated, so-called commitments associated with the Paris Agreement, right? So in this kind of role, implementing carbon removals at scale is particularly important, right? Forests can play a role in that scenario. But also, maybe even more important, is that climate finance can be a kind of a tool to improve not only the protection, but also to restore important ecosystems, right? And from what I'm gonna show you is that, if we do the right connection between the forest and the climate agenda, this will be associated with significant financial flows through forest restoration to those countries in a way that we could avoid some risks that are associated with forests, right? And just to mention one piece, but there are many ones showing that, tropical forests, they are under, risk of losing its integrity, right? This paper that was published last year, in which they show that, the whole Amazon forest, there are some estimates that between 10 to 45% of the Amazon is exposed to disturbances that could trigger a process in which the forest will become a different forest, right? Not necessarily a savanna, but a different forest. And along this process, you're going to lose biodiversity, you're going to lose lots of carbon. right? So I think there's this other way in which, the climate agenda can provide some resources to avoid these kind of tipping points that are so important, especially, in a context that we don't really fully understand the role of forests in our lives, in our society, right? So this is, pretty much the problem that we would like to deal with, is this connection, right? On top of that, if you look, around, there are many, there is a kind of an effective policy framework that have been developed in different countries to deal with forest management in all of these three different challenges, right? The forest protection, in terms of, have protected areas, indigenous territories that have been quite effective in protecting some areas that are of interest. We have land use regulations that have been implemented in different places. Enforcement sometimes is an issue, but there are, ways of, setting up rules for exploiting those areas. There are big changes in the enforcement system, especially using satellite-based monitoring and things like that becomes super effective. And also the use of economic incentives, right? So if you look around, in many countries, what you'll find is that you'll find a relatively effective policy framework to deal with the forest challenges, right? But in parallel, what we also learn from the literature is that, although we have that framework, they're still exposed to political risks, right? They are exposed to electoral cycles, right? There are some evidence showing that, as during the electoral cycle, deforestation, picks up and down depending on the situation. And also it's exposed to local politics and to local interests groups. So, although we have that kind of framework to deal with forests, in the end of the day, they are not robust due to shifts in the management of all countries. And if anything, I think we're learning that, dealing with political volatility is something that is becoming more and more important over time, right? So this is why I think it's important to think about a financial structure that could provide incentives for those countries to better manage, to use their tools that are effective in the best way, right? So it's in that context that I'd like to bring a kind of a proposal that we're trying to elaborate based on this research that I mentioned before. And this proposal, it fits on the kind of an existing pipeline of mechanisms and ideas that are out there. And basically what we have is we have the REDD+ mechanisms that, although they can accommodate things associated with forest restoration, they are primarily focusing on reducing deforestation. Right? If you look in practice, the implementation of the REDD+ mechanisms, usually they consider kind of a baseline for deforestation rates, and they pay for the countries for improving, for reducing deforestation against that baseline. Right? And the Brazilian government, as Bart mentioned before, is promoting this idea of TFFF, which is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. And the idea of TFFF is that you're going to pay a certain amount of dollars, $4 per hectare of standing forests for eligible countries. And there are some mechanism of punishing for deforestation and some other details, but it's a mechanism that is primarily designed to deal with, compensating standing forests. So what we have in terms of the pipeline of incentives is these two mechanisms, right? One mechanism that is doing that is relating to reducing deforestation, another mechanism that is rewarding the standing forest. There's a big gap on this whole scenario, which is we need a mechanism that could deliver large scale, forest restoration. That's the gap that we'd like to address. And it's particularly important because in COP28, during this exercise that they did, the global stock take, countries agree on this concept, right? That we should do, this is how they usually frame those things, enhance efforts towards halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation by 2030, right? So we're trying to work on this enhancing efforts. That's the action. Maybe that's the economics of doing nothing. So we are, we are using that language and proposing this reversing deforestation mechanism as a way of, filling that gap, right? And this is a mechanism that we study in very detail in this paper that I mentioned with Mesay, Larson and Todd Manson, in which you look at, in that paper we take the advantage that for the Brazilian Amazon, we have very detailed data, not only on the potential for forest restoration, but also revenues in terms of the alternative activity, which is in our case is cattle ranching primarily. And from that, we can really understand, the economics, taking into account the dynamics of carbon capture and its association with the forest dynamics and the land use changes, right? And then based on that, what you're studying is a kind of a framework that in this language of climate is performance-based and jurisdictional. Right, performance-based in the sense that you provide the service, you observe the service being provided, and then you get paid, right? And in jurisdiction, because you're talking about a large area, to avoid leakages, to avoid a situation which, the seller is cherry picking areas that will be used, putting the game of forest restoration, deforesting the rest, right? So in order to avoid that kind of situation, it's important to keep the jurisdictional approach to that thing, right? And this mechanism will complement RED Plus and TFFF, trying to fill in this gap. Yes. So let me show you how it's going to work. We are thinking about, a jurisdiction, which is typically a tropical country, right? And it can sign off kind of a bilateral offtake agreement with a buyer. What you have in mind is some, it could be European ETS, right? Or some. It's quite important to be a unit here in the demand side. You need something that could have some scale, right? And a willingness to pay that is high enough, right? And then the jurisdiction will sell carbon credits, to the buyer, and those credits will be associated with, net carbon removals. Right, and these net carbon removals are the amount of CO2 that is captured through forest restoration, and here everything is calibrated to natural regeneration, minus what is being emitted in that jurisdiction, considering agriculture and deforestation and forest degradation, right? So the jurisdiction is providing the service of capturing carbon on a net basis to the buyer, right? And the buyer is going to pay a price for each ton of CO2 that is captured on that regime, right? Let's say $50, right? And since we are talking about carbon removals in the net sense for a jurisdiction, we can talk about prices that are much higher than the price that you observe in voluntary markets, things that are associated with avoided deforestation, because the contribution of these to the climate is totally different, right? I think it's important to have that in mind. And the idea is that this money will go to a kind of a jurisdictional fund. And since this is a performance-based mechanism, the jurisdiction, should have flexibility for use the resources in a way that will better fit its goals, right? So the idea is that they could use this money in order to do all of the activities that are associated with the provision of the service of implementing the carbon capture, right? From conservation, providing some support for indigenous territories, enforcement with a more effective way, up to payment for ecosystem services. In the end, you could rent some farms. You could have offers to farms to rent the land just to let the forest regrow in those lands, right? Once you have that thing, right? There is one issue that BARD was exploiting, which is this time consistency of the system, right? And here in the forest restoration, this is particularly important because the dynamics of carbon capture is such that, when the forest started to regrow, the carbon capture is higher. And over time, the carbon sequestration becomes lower and lower. In about 100 years, it reached a kind of an equilibrium, right? So there's a kind of a dynamic issue here associated with the fact that, down the road, the incentives to keep on the mechanism, decreases because the amount of money that you made, increases, and the amount of money that you can make decreases, right? So that's the an issue that needs to be addressed. One way of addressing these issues, exactly how Bart has described, is to use some kind of a forgivable loans structure in order to deal with that. Another possibility will be to have a kind of a permanence fund in which for each ton that the buyer is getting, it's going to pay $3 on a separate fund, and this fund will accumulate this money. And according to some simulations that we did, related to our paper, in which we have more data, we show that after 40 years, we'll have enough money in this permanence fund that we could reward the forest that has been restored using the TFFF rules, right? And this will be incentive that will be large enough for the jurisdiction to not effect on the mechanism, right? So, but there are other ways of implementing this, and usually people are trying to avoid the conversation about forest because they claim that forest is hard to deal with, but in practice there are many ways of addressing those issues, right? I think it shouldn't be an excuse in order to not talk about this better possibility, right? So there are some implementation essentials here that I'd like to pay attention. So the first one is this jurisdiction approach is important because we avoid leakages, right? The carbon accounting is particularly important to have two things here. One is to focus on this net basis, right? To make sure that the jurisdiction is providing a positive contribution to climate. The second one is that we need to develop a way of monitoring carbon associated with this process that is relatively cheap and reliable. And this is part of the work that we've been developing in parallel within the group. Scale is super important. Given what we have now, compliance markers is probably the best way of getting the necessary scale here. Using the structure that we have, something around Article 6 will be a possibility here to get the scale, the right prices, and so on. The permanent safeguards are already told about the possible solutions. Could be a permanence fund or these forgivable loans. There's another aspect that is people don't usually when you talk about forests, people are primarily focusing on the risks of permanence of those forests that has been restored, right? But there's another dynamic issue which is associated with the buyer, right? It's very important for the jurisdiction who is giving up of the alternative activities to let the forest regrow, make sure that the commitment is there in order to pay as the forest is regrown, right? So to think about the structures that will address that issue is something quite important. As I mentioned, the use of proceeds should be flexible because we are trying to deal with a results-based system. Now, many applications in which you're talking about this payment for ecosystem services, people put a lot of restrictions on the use of proceeds, which make things really hard to be implemented in practice. We have some examples of that. And this is although this is a deal that involves a lot of government, there's still some role for private sector here, both actually providing some active restoration services or exploiting the forest in a way that is compatible with the forest itself, right? And so these forest products. So just to give an idea about the scale of what you're talking about here, the scale is the following. Here, I'm taking advantage that we have detailed information about the carbon potential for each one of the areas of those countries, right? So we can think about the distribution of it. And here I'm simulating two carbon price scenario with $25 per ton. That's the distribution of the amount of land that you find, the amount of or carbon that you can capture according to the present value per hectare of the carbon capture, right? So what you have is that with $25, you could find worldwide 120 million hectares of forest that could generate more than $5,000 per hectare. Right? So if you compare these figures with land prices, this is a pretty significant number, right? And if we are moving towards $50, with $50, we can find 175 million hectares that could generate, in terms of present value of the forest restoration income flows, more than $5,000, right? And this would capture 46 gigatons, right? This is one simulation. I'm going to stop with the second simulation here, in which we take the enhanced efforts of the global 28 of the global stock take seriously, and put all of the areas that is available into forest restoration, in 2030. And what you would get is that, in the first 5 years, you'll get on average 2 gigatons of CO2 that will be captured by those areas. Brazil, DRC, and Indonesia are the most important ones, but there are many countries that will benefit from this. If you consider a carbon price of $50, we're talking about $100 billion per year of transfers, for, let's say, the north to the south, in exchange for the service of providing carbon capture at scale, right? So I think the message here is that there are a much productive and promising way of connecting, the forest and the climate agendas in a way that, the forest can benefit from the resources on the climate agenda, and also the climate can, have some removals at scale being implemented in a way that would put us in a little better position in order to do that. Thank you so much.
Many thanks. Before I invite our discussant to make some comments to draw things together, I don't know if anybody has a question for Giuliano specifically about the presentation. Yes.
A very quick one about this figure here. Only area deforested from 2001 to 2023. Surely some of those areas are now quite sort of high value agricultural areas now. So surely the sort of opportunity cost is going to be pretty high for reforestation efforts, right?
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have the economic data for all the countries. In case of Brazil, what we see in the data is that the main alternative activity is cattle ranching, is very low productive. And actually with $25 per ton, you basically, most of the areas, almost all areas that is the forest will be better used into this mechanism than in the others. Maybe in other countries will be different. But if you think in terms of the numbers, the figures that I got in terms of land prices, which is something that we can compare with the numbers that I showed before, $5,000 per hectare is a relatively high number for these countries usually. Right? So I would expect that this would happen, especially if you take into account that Brazil, Congo, and Indonesia account for a significant portion of that. Right? I don't expect that this high value land will be significant in the area.
As a co-author of this study, I really would encourage people to get data from other countries and do the same exercise. I mean, the exercise is very explicit in our paper. We have all the programs which are public, have all the data on. For Brazil, we did a slightly different dating because it depends when you have satellite data information. So Brazil started in the 80s, right? So we have everything that has been deforested since the 80s. So it may vary from country to country what you can get in terms of satellite data, and will vary. And of course, economic activity depends. In Brazil, we use the agricultural census, which is it's pretty rough data. So we use a lot of Bayesian statistics to figure out, to get estimates, to get bounds on estimates, etc. But I would really encourage, people that think of PhD thesis to look at some of those other countries.
We can provide a lot of support for those.
Yeah, we can provide.
Thank you for that, really ambitious and thought-provoking proposal. I want to make sure that we have time for our discussant, who's been very patient, so thank you. We have Sir Andrew Steer with us. Andrew is a professor in practice at the LSE Global School of Sustainability and also the International Growth Centre. So, Andrew, can I hand over to you for your discussion points, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giles. Wow, I'm so pleased we had this session today. Thank you to the organisers. Thank you, Robin. There is a massive research agenda in the forests, especially the tropical forests, and we need economists to really engage. We spoke mainly today about climate change, but the topic was actually the title was biodiversity, and it is important to remember that everything, and you made the point very well, Juliana, that this is where the biodiversity is. It's worth remembering that there are 65,000 species of vertebrates in the world. One of those species has doubled in population in the last 50 years. And if you take all the other species together, the vertebrates, and you count them up, and I'm looking at Jim Lee because he was head of WWF International when they did this analysis, add all the other 64,999 together, their population declined by over 60%. One doubled, the rest fell by. Guess who the one is? And we have a serious crisis about it. We are, by the way. It's humans. So we have a very serious crisis. Bard, you reminded me why we need economists at the COPs. I am embarrassed to tell you that I have been to 16 climate COPs. And we don't have enough people there sitting in rooms saying, let's look at this through the eyes of those who make real decisions, whether they're farmers in Brazil or whoever they are. And you took us through in a very sort of systematic way. That's what we have to do. And thank you for doing that. I like, oh, by the way, I mean, you use the sort of north-south. Doesn't mean that the only people who care about the forests are those in the north. He just uses, the economists do that, as you know. So you might want different letters in the future because actually people in the south care even more about forests than those in the north, especially if you happen to be an indigenous person and they've got a great deal to teach us. But I'm pulling your leg a bit there, Bart, because I love your points on credibility, free rider, and the conservation multiplier. I think your points on time consistency are really useful, and the sort of moral hazard issues. Countries like Gabon, as you know, have been grumbling for years that they don't get very much carbon market money. Why? Because they haven't chopped their trees down and nobody thinks they will. They still have, what, 83% of their entire country is still forested. And so they've been on the warpath to say, wait a minute, this is just not fair. You should not reward those that are cutting down their forests, sort of thing. And tonight at 6 o'clock, you'll hear some speakers, one of which is Michael Greenstone, and he will be talking about a grand bargain. And Jose will also be talking there with some very relevant issues to address precisely that problem. I'd like just to say one word, Bart, about the next paper you need to write. As you, if you like, extend this model, I think it'd be great to have two southern voices, one the farmers that have to make a decision, and the other that actually care a lot. You could call them South environmentalists or something. Whilst the North may be bringing money in the form of the compensation, the South environmentalists are bringing political lobbying, analysis, and new ideas, and trying to influence governments. And if you look right now at a place like Brazil, it's absolutely vibrant in terms of that initiative, if you like, including sort of what a bioeconomy might look like, who do we lobby? And I think if you could sort of explore that, I think it would make it just much richer in terms of the real world. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. Giuliano, I'm so pleased that you sort of brought restoration in. There's been a rather sort of unfortunate competition between the conservation people and the restoration people. And the conservation people tend to say, look, don't worry about restoration until you've conserved, because dollar for dollar, you get more out of putting money into conservation or preservation than you do into restoration. That's not a very useful discussion, quite frankly. And what you're saying is we should think about them together and have a net approach. And it seems to me that's exactly what you do. The subject of restoration is rising very rapidly at the moment, just like the whole subject of nature is. In the old days, you know, if you went to the climate COP, very exciting, tens of thousands of people all talking about energy. You went to the biodiversity COP, pretty bunch of, you know, well-meaning NGOs that actually know dynamism. That's changed now. I mean, the last two biodiversity COPs have been just as lively. Nature is rising. Restoration is rising for several reasons. One, we need now to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Restoration helps do it. Second, with ODA falling so rapidly, actually, if you're an official in FCDO or in the World Bank, you want to double dip. You want to get credit for addressing climate change and credit for addressing development. Restoration is a dream on that. Also, technology now has changed everything. We now can not only see every tree in the world falling from satellites, we actually can now see them regrowing. Tomorrow, actually, in New York, I'll be at the launch of the next phase of World Resources Institute Land and Carbon Lab, which is using AI now, as are other organizations, to do things we never could have done. So in restoration, we can now monitor in a far, far better way than we could before. So that's, I think, really exciting. And I think also there's a sort of political issue at the moment where dealing with decarbonization is politically a bit tricky in some countries, whilst dealing with nature is totally bipartisan. So this is a great time to do it. Just a couple of points. I was so pleased that you talked about the need for sort of more economic analysis. There's still a great deal we don't know about the alternative livelihoods. I mean, huge amount of fantastic work going on what's called the bioeconomy in places like Brazil. We actually don't really know yet if that alternative path is competitive and how much subsidy it needs. You know, at the moment in Indonesia, President Prabowo is bringing in the bulldozers, cutting down a lot of forest in order to plant rice and palm oil. Well, we keep saying there's a better path, and we don't actually have a very compelling narrative for that economically. So we do need to do that. I love the RDM, the reverse deforestation mechanism. I think it overcomes this competition between the two. The jurisdictional approach is absolutely right. It's more difficult, but it's very important. So if anybody's interested in working on sort of the economics of restoration, Charles and I are having some thoughts about maybe a sort of real flagship program here on that, but it would be great if we could think about an international effort. And thank you for the, what do you call it, enhanced efforts that we're going to see. And I've got a feeling that actually the LM conference, thanks to you guys, will be a lot more effective than some people thought it would be. Thanks very much.
Many thanks for that, Andrew, and many thanks again to our keynote speakers who have been given their homework as well. You know, so we have a deadline on the papers that now need to be written by our keynote speakers. But I think we just about run out of time, so we have to have a break before the next session. So please join me once more in thanking not only our discussant Andrew, but also our keynote speakers. Bard and Giuliano. It's been a fantastic session. I'm very grateful to all our speakers for making it so. Thank you very much.
Oh, you want? Sorry.
Literally.
Okay, I think we can start. Things have to be quiet for fireside chat. Okay, thank you. I'm really happy that Sherry Rahman is with us for this conversation on essentially what her role has been as minister not so long ago for climate change in Pakistan. And she got to see COP from that angle. She was instrumental in COP27 taking important directions. She will talk about that. First, let me give a very brief introduction to Sherry. Sherry is a politician. She's vice president of Pakistan People Party. She's a member of the upper house. She's a senator. She was the woman leader of the opposition in the Senate. She sits on several Senate subcommittees, including the very important Audit and Accounts Subcommittee.
No, I chair it.
She chairs it.
Thank you.
Chairs it. And I think I'll start reading in case I make a
Okay,
mistake.
don't. That's enough, I think.
Okay, so she comes with a very rich background in politics and an interest in climate change, and actually having hands-on experience in shaping debates in COP, especially COP27. And I think we will, in the course of the conversation, bring out some of her learning to inform ourselves of what to expect from COP30 in terms of commitments, in terms of the quality of dialogue between the rich and poor countries to move the climate change agenda. Sherry, we'll talk about more broadly about what it means for different countries. But to bring home the context, let's start with the example of Pakistan. Let's start first by talking about why Pakistan is considered to be a sort of a frontier state in terms of some of the consequences of climate change that we are witnessing. So maybe you want to talk about a little bit about the floods of 22, which got you involved in the whole thing, but also the most recent floods in 2025.
Ongoing, right. Thank you very much, Professor Nabi. And thank you to LSC and the organizers of this spectacular conference for convening it and bringing it all together. And why I'm calling it spectacular, maybe it's an oversell, is because there are less and less people interested in climate change. There are less and less people interested in the environment, in the forests, in any new thinking, let alone inconvenient truths about how the world and all of us, because we are some of its parts, are navigating this truly existential crisis. Now, I heard the last couple of, I do want to say that they're very innovative and they offer solutions. So I think perhaps in the panel or sometime we can talk about that. But, 2022 was a defining moment for all of Pakistan, because we actually discovered climate change as a country on what it means. And when I say climate change, it's shorthand for obviously the environment now. That's how we think about it. The actual ministry is only called climate change, but deals with environment issues. It took a while for even my ministry to understand what they were doing, because primarily our climate change offices are set up to deal or navigate at least 26 international and multilateral treaties that we are part of. And so the idea is to be part of the solution, but now the solutions after 2022 were clearly needed yesterday at home and in very short order. So what went on is that 1/3 of the country was inundated in what we hadn't experienced before. Now, Pakistan is very familiar with flooding. It's familiar with riverine flooding. We have one huge river that runs diagonally across the country, following the map of the country. It's called the Great Indus River, and it's based on the civilization that we talk about. Having said that, this river floods every so often. It's an ancient river. It's changed its course like many rivers do. But along it, like all civilizations, the Nile and all other big rivers, clusters of people tend to build around it. They tend to farm land around it. And it's literally the province, the Delta province I am from, it's literally called the mother of the country. Now, this mother has a way of moving around, and it needs free course to the sea. But what happened in 2022 was this was not a flood that originated. A riverine flood originates always at source, which is in the north of the country. Now, we are home to at least 7,000 glaciers, more than any mass other than the north, the polar region, which people don't really know about. People think of Pakistan as more desertified. It is not. It has a mountain to delta topography, which literally makes policymakers like, okay, now we're dealing with glacier melt in the north, which we are, very accelerated. And that's usually where the flooding occurs and comes down in very big tidal waves. And here this year, 2025, as I speak, the river is in high flood, and it's on its way to the delta. It's destroyed it's killed 1,000 people plus already. The numbers keep changing every half a day. But 2022 was like a rain dump, a water dump from the sky. So we discovered words like cloudburst, and now that's become very, that's daily jargon. And the whole country was, what just happened? That kind of erratic, extreme, turbulent, and unpredictable weather continues to pelt Pakistan. It happened even this year. Now, while the river flood was raging, we have something called the monsoons, which is a South Asian thing. And I grew up in a South Asia, or rather a Karachi and Pakistan, where they were fairly gentle most of the time. And so all of South Asia, the Gangetic Plain, etc., has written its greatest poetry around it. And you don't write, you don't make film songs about nasty monsoons. But now they've turned, even in India, very, very volatile, very dangerous, and it's no longer a one-off thing. You would get a bad flood in a decade, say, and the last one was 2010. I remember the international community coming in big numbers, trying to do a heavy lift on evacuations. So, on television, all you're seeing now is rescue, search, rescue, disaster management, running here, running there. But in 2022, when I was minister, just appointed, we were in complete overstretch. The entire country was like, how are we going to cope with this 1/3 of the country underwater? And that was mostly in the south because the rain just wouldn't. So like a year's rain would fall in 3 hours, something like that. The millimeter count was that bad. So other than urban flooding, we had the Navy, small boats, not rescue rafts, had to go into areas which you and I may have been living in if we were farmers, for instance. So the Navy was operating inside in land, literally, not just on the riverbank. So pretty much that 1/3 became a big floodplain. And clinics were drowning, and the most impacted were frankly the most vulnerable, which are women, children, and people over 60, seniors. 650,000 women were caught during different stages of pregnancy. Many were giving birth on lifeboats. So it was, and it was biblical. The scale was biblical. We saw it as that and we were like, all right, now stop calling this. And I then went around getting the attribution studies. They eventually came. And luckily, Ijaz, for if I may call you by by your first name, what, Mente Liberty.
Call me Professor Nabi.
No, because I don't allow, everybody gets called ambassador, and suddenly it's Sherry, I'm like, excuse me.
Sorry, she was also ambassador.
Never mind. So back to this horror show where Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, arrived in Pakistan. He was horrified and he said, what's going on here? I said, well, now we're the ground zero of climate change because the heat wave that this flood had followed was also 53 degrees centigrade. And I discovered that 3 years running in the south of the country, there were hotspots where this is becoming the norm. Now, are people actually supposed to survive, work, till the land, do anything, take their children to school, do anything in that temperature? No, they're not. You could fry an egg on the pavement. I mean, that's me being extreme. I was also information minister, so I do these things, but so this was what was playing out, country in total overstretch. And it took, I mean, there are still areas of the country where large bodies of water have formed and people have had to move away. So the level of trauma and shock was great, but the macroeconomic exogenous shock was also great, which is how this resilience fund came up when we went to Geneva and New York.
So let me just, so 22 was epic in the sense, in terms of its dimensions, etc. Then we had a couple of relatively quiet monsoons. And then in 25, again, it has come in a big way. They're still counting the losses associated with the damage associated with it, but it's going to get into very large numbers because this time the cloud burst and the dumps have affected other parts of the country, which is really the granary of the country. So the crops, there's huge damage to crops, rice, wheat, sugarcane, other crops. So the estimates are still coming in as to what the actual total dimension of the damage will be. I want to take this conversation next to, so the flood of 22 happens, you're the Minister for Climate Change. What takes you to COP27?
I made it everyone's problem. I decided that it was everyone's problem. For one thing, I didn't see it as just a humanitarian crisis, which is episodic, right? And so I had fought viciously for myself, given the cabinet, federal cabinet, a PowerPoint, which I don't like to use, on the impacts of climate change in Pakistan. I said, you guys have to understand this is happening to us. And a month later, the big flood came. So they were like, you warned us. I said, we're a fractional emitter, less than 1% of global emissions, and we're getting 53 degrees. You guys need to think about the heat wave because the forests were burning. Now, the earlier presentations were about, forests. We had a juniper forest burn that it takes about 40 years for those trees to actually grow. And they provided livelihoods and exports, so on and so forth. And I live half the time in Islamabad, beautiful mountains. You see the Margala Hills, and there was constant smoke. And we were putting out fires, both real and metaphorical, everywhere. So I said, listen, we had to call in, finally through the Foreign Ministry, I said, look, the fire is not going down. We had to call in a plane from a water dumping plane, special thing, from Iran, which was right next door, because they had the same, Turkey and Iran. We asked both whoever's fastest. Somebody sent one and it had to be put out like that. And of course, the day you dump the water from a plane coming in from somewhere else, the rain comes in. That's just how it works. So we had multiple crises ongoing. The glacial melt had already accelerated in 2022 very fast, almost 16%. And we have, the really big glaciers. These are melting down, and you see horror videos of local communities, infrastructure, small hydro plants, beautiful mountains, stunning scenery, all of them being swept away like bridges going down like toothpicks. You're wondering, where is this angry water coming from? It's the glacial lake outburst floods. So it took me a month to educate the country. I don't think that I've managed that this is a glacier, what this means. It's why is it melting? Why can't we turn off the heat? Everybody wants to know. Fair enough. Why we can't do something about the heat? I said, well, you can only, you can adapt, you can build resilience, you can grow the forests, but that sequestering of carbon will take forever, and
Everybody's familiar with GLOF.
A glacial lake outburst flood.
What happens is that the glaciers heats up from inside, and there's a lot of water that gets accumulated, and a point comes when it bursts the ice walls around it, and then it comes down in very large volumes. So GLOFs have contributed enormously to the flooding, both in 22, but most recently in 25.
They cause what are known as flash floods. They actually melt down quite creepily and don't burst immediately. They come down slowly as glaciers melt. They make frozen lakes. The summer is changing and all that. Then you get a heat wave, that lake then bursts. It's already accumulated body of water, and then it comes down with boulders and the fury of, the water, very destructive, volatile water. So that, and the heat wave was already there. And, the burning forest. So you're like, okay, this is all happening. We have heat wave centers going up, and, you tell people 44% living in poverty, how are you going to explain to them to get to a cool place? They're working the land or builders, that's their daily wage. So it's all linked to the economics of survival. And I just want to say, you get to COP and everybody is humbled by, if I show you those videos, you will just all be quiet. The docus made. And so everybody understood that this could come to their doorstep, right? But the reality is it's not coming to the cold climates this fast. But as I said at Harvard last year, it's coming to everyone's doorstep. So it's a common problem. And I really appreciate that we're having a common outcome discussion. That's why COP.
So, just walk us through your interactions at COP and how you got them to focus on what was your major contribution in setting up the damage and loss.
Luckily, we realized we're head of something called the G77 plus China. So this is a developing countries group, and it's no longer 77. It's a rotational, multilateral chairing that goes from country to country. And you just chair 1 or 2 meetings at the UN and get on with it. And I said, hang on, we're chair this year, and G77 is actually G135. It's that many countries. So get it together, guys, and we are going to get the loss and damage fund here, because the one thing politicians should know is numbers matter. And that's far outnumbers any mass. So we had the critical mass. I spent 2 weeks just constantly convening groups of countries. So small island states have a head or chair. Maybe it's Maldives 1 year, whatever. Less developed countries had a chair. Bangladesh, very, very much with me. Latin America, Caribbean, they were like 6, 7 big groups. West Asia, which is often called the Middle East, all of them were represented. So we used that chairing as with great convening power, secured rooms, made them aware that this loss and damage funds needs to be instituted and accepted. I was told a flat no by many countries. That's not going to happen. The North especially, no, please don't waste your time. My ministry said time to go home. Ministers leave usually by the middle of the conference. I'm like, no, we have to get this done. So I made a lot of the other heads of groups stay back, connected with them on WhatsApp, kept them active. And here's what COPs do. They are designed to follow only the agenda of the presidency. If the presidency doesn't really want to push it for whatever reason, they will make sure that the real voting happens after the actual conference is over, bizarrely speaking, by which time you don't have hotel rooms, everybody's bleary-eyed, momentum is gone, vitality is sapped. So we had to keep doing that and literally sleeping outside the president's door because the meeting would be called at 3 a.m. This is how the COPs are conducted, by the way, and in the negotiating rooms. So it's just getting the language right, getting everybody accommodated, somebody wants something in and fighting. So we did all that. And 3 days after the official COP was over, with shared hotel rooms, no staff, nothing, I have to compliment all the heads of the other groups. We just said, no, this has to happen, we're not leaving. It happened. After that, it's become routinized in the UNFCCC system, and it's disappeared from everybody's view. What do you want to know?
So that's how the damage and loss fund.
So it's a moral victory, and everybody campaigning for it understood that, and moral victories still matter to the dispossessed. And they turned around and they said, but why are you doing this? Because it acknowledges the Paris principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which means the polluter pays. Now, strictly, that's technically wrong. It's not pollution, it's emissions. Pollution is different. We can take control of that. And so emitter pays, meaning if you're a historic emitter or you're a big emitter now and you've built your wealth on the backs of climate colonialism, that's what we call it, you then get to make the transfers to the global south, which neither has the capacity, the ability to coordinate, or even make the technical leapfrogging you see at so many presentations. People they cannot work their assets. They cannot monetize their assets. I mean, remarkably, Pakistan's got a mangrove monetization going on which sequesters carbon, say 4 times or 5 times as much as a normal forest, a normal tree, a rainforest tree. So a mangrove will sequester or capture 5 times. It has been monetized. So the entire delta is in a voluntary carbon agreement, voluntary trade market. And somehow we've done it. But it'll bring in, say, $40 million to just regenerate the delta. That's where it's all going back into regenerating and regrowing the delta, because that's also been destroyed by years of drought. So we go from deluge to drought. That is a classic, as you know, symptom of climate change. So you go from desertification to deluge, and that's how it works. So half the country is desertified, half the country is flooded.
So we are now heading towards COP30. So there's a lot of accumulated experience and what happens at these conferences. We know that as far as climate finance is concerned, its delivery to developing countries is really pathetic. Regardless of the commitments that get made, we know that huge commitments were made, $600 billion in the Paris Agreement. But developing countries saw a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So if COPs are not facilitating developing country access to climate finance, what is it that COPs actually contribute?
So, I mean, I don't understand. I'm doing a panel on this later, and I'm reluctant to share my, infamous wisdoms on that with you. I call them infamous because I have very strong views on COPs and what they mean and why we should or should not, what we should or should not do at them, because, that's the last gasp of multilateralism that actually may work. So as a politician, I get up every morning with some kind of investment in hope. Without that, you can't accomplish anything. And to me, the COP represents a multitude of failures, of course, but also an abundance of intellectual and activism riches, okay? So there's many number of representations there. And it's a question of, I guess a triumph of hope over actual experience now, because this particular COP is coming at it on the back of two COPs that have had trouble keeping the momentum going, to put it very politely. I'm going to be polite. And so there we feel, I mean, I don't know, do people know that Brazil has cut rainforests to make the road to Belém? Or that it's so overpriced that even the UN is cutting its staff? I don't know how many people can attend. So it's going to be
COP is overpriced, the actual
this particular
venue.
COP 30, well, if you're gonna pay $1,500 per night, then it's going to be tough, okay? And as it is, at least half the COP sometimes, it should not be only performative. It should not sort of devolve into theater, which politics does. It should be good theater at least, and promise something. And in that, in those transactions that go on, a lot of the gap between pledges and promises and what actually rolls out as outcomes is growing. Now, we can all say, okay, the COPs are fantastic. They are in some parts. When they deliver, I mean, you remember the Paris Agreement. It made everybody smile through the whole sort of week. And you felt that, okay, there is a future ahead for all of us, and it's collective and big moment. 10 years from now, that was 10 years ago, you're staring at a barrel of 4 degrees centigrade at the end of century. Now that's just way too high, but currently, as we stand, I don't understand what small and micro projects are going to do. Disparate, fragmented response by the whole world, all of us, in our countries and outside our countries. So what you see is emissions going up. They're going up still. And they are also now, so is global warming. Every month you will hear, oh, this is the hottest month of the year that we have known so far. 2024, 2023, you heard that. It's just going to keep going that way. And some countries will just start boiling. And we're on the boiling front line.
Yeah, 53 degrees centigrade.
That's not fit for human anything. You know that. That would be, I mean, you don't want a COP that's the politics of doing nothing. The economics of doing nothing is very attractive. But we want the big transition. We want the big, the grand bargain to work, because that's what the COP is built on. It's built on a promise that we're going to do this together for each other. And we're failing on that promise. I'm not here to just blame big emitters. I mean, the UK is doing its bit. We all know that, or maybe don't, but it is. The EU is, but I'm sorry. I think the stock takes are no longer transparent or inclusive. The stock takes have to report, and they have to report clearly, fairly, and transparently all the data they're gathering. At least do this, because none of you can make your models and find solutions that apply to different topographies if you don't have the data. Nation states make the agreement, all of them, they have to supply the data. So at least that should be mandatory. There is even no definition at the UNFCCC for climate finance. Do you know that? Which allows countries, as mentioned here, to double climate finance as ODA, to double it as, as loans, to put it down even as procurements. So from other countries. That's what happened at Geneva. We went to Geneva after 2022. We had a 45 billion loss and damage, economic losses, other losses, and more damage. It was computed. The whole thing was shown over there. $10 billion were pledged. To this day, I think about 4 billion have arrived. And Some of it was, half of it was on procurement of some things, maybe oil, other things. So that's how the aid flows went. Like, the humanitarian aid flows are fast. They're very much needed, as is the, the shoulder to the wheel, that the heavy lift that the UN OCHA and the UN agencies then step in and do. But frankly, I mean, the MDBs are, what are they doing? They're just providing loans. There are no grants anymore. And that was the heart of the Bretton Woods system. So what's going on here? Pakistan's debt portfolio is $280 billion, I think, yes, as of yesterday or June. And we need, out of this country assessment report that the World Bank did, as of COP27, $348 billion just until 2030. That's 5 years from now, to keep our heads above water. So where are we supposed to raise the money and the capacity? And I am not I'm not making our own governments and people, I'm not absolving people from responsibility. If I could theme a COP for you, I would theme it a capital R and responsibility. Everybody take responsibility for their actions, for their commitments, for their pledges. You will have a COP that's fixed. Right now, the system is broken, understand that.
So
Yeah.
let's talk about that a little bit. We understand something about carbon finance in the context of emissions, because the literature on carbon markets has allowed us to come to grips with that. But when it comes to climate finance for adaptation, that's still very much done in the old framework of, the World Bank is going to lend money to a country. The World Bank knows what the technologies are for agriculture, for manufacturing. We're going to tweak these technologies so that the countries become more adapted to climate change. That's the kind of logic that operates. And therefore, we'll use World Bank financing windows to finance adaptation. What has been your experience with this? Is the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, are they able to do this? Or as people spoke about it at one time, we should create new specialized institutions that will only talk about climate adaptation, climate finance in the context of specialized technologies. What is your view on that?
I don't think you need specialized technologies. You are a very clever set of economists who are getting me to say the same thing I've planned to say over there. But no, MDBs, look, in Pakistan, we only have really the ADB and the World Bank, and the World Bank does its bit. It does a lot of the capacity work. But I mean, I'll give you an example of, I said it on BBC the other day for a documentary. The UN is a good faith actor, but it's a vast bureaucracy with lots of slippage, just like Pakistan. We're all the same. So I don't like anyone hectoring or lecturing. We have, for instance, capacity building officers assigned to me, Ijaz, as a minister. Ma'am, there are two of our people working in your office doing exactly that. They're designing the framework because there's no knowledge, there's no wisdom. In Pakistan, it's too cutting edge. We're catching up every time with the numbers, the data, the experiments, the tech, whatever. And you have ghost workers. So I said, excuse me, ghost workers, they're ghost workers. Every time I go into their office, they're not there. What do you mean? What do you mean they're not there? I said, try me, come in today. And they're like, you go to the third floor and you check. I said, yeah, that's just the kind of neurotic person I am. I want to see why they are never. So anyway, that goes on. This goes on all the time. We're technically getting assistance, but it's often not there, or it's taking away 30% of the project cost, or worse, well-meaning MDBs, all consortiums come in, we're greening Pakistan. Oh, lovely. That's great, because we have no forest cover left, only 5%, the lowest in South Asia. Looking forward, when I look at it, it's 4 projects in 4 different provinces. They've ticked their boxes, and so have we. All good. Perfect. We accepted it, they gave it. I said, how are you calling this? This is green, this is 4 districts, parts of 4 little districts you're greening, the size of the LSE building. That's how it works. I said, these are pilots. I am so tired of pilots. Everyone is bringing their pilots to test. And some of them are very smart. The climate smart agriculture pilot was brilliant. But it couldn't work down south, further down south, because the drip irrigation was drying up in the extreme heat. So there are not yet solutions for very extreme temperature zones. We're still talking in sanguine cold climates here. And there is no technical capacity to create the kind of climate smart agriculture it is being done there. Some of the people are innovating themselves, but survival to scale is a big challenge. So it's survival and subsistence cycles. And while you're resetting the country back, say the World Bank has done a smart thing, it's gone for building resilient homes in the province of the Delta province of Sindh, where I'm from. 2 million resilient homes are being built. So the political party I'm from prefers to empower women. If there's a man and a woman for the job, I'll get the job, or I'll fight my way to it and they'll let it. But also they prefer to ensure that women are not facing more of inequity on the ground. It's bad enough. And then, so we're giving the land titles, the new land, to the women. They've all moved away from the delta where they were living on the floodplain, and they've had to all relocate. They were all tilling lands that they did not have land titles to. This is a very common problem in developing countries. And so they're all getting their land titles, their little resilient homes that the World Bank is helping to finance. But if these are all loans, the government is co-financing this, and it's almost half done. Now, I am just holding my breath that the flood is not going to go back to that same exact area which we are rebuilding, and it'll take us another 2 years. But I mean, that's the cost, the price of resilience, and it's being felt by the most vulnerable.
I want to draw your attention to something else. When it comes to capabilities and commitment, things become complicated when we are talking about resources or skills moving from the rich countries to the poor countries. Let's talk about a big pollution issue, which is air pollution. Which is both the result of poor emissions control as well as poor adaptation. Entirely in the control of Pakistan.
Absolutely.
Okay, all the committers are there, all the adaptation technology is known, the enforcement mechanisms exist. The government makes all the right sounds when it comes to, when in mid-October, cities like Lahore will become impossible to live in because the quality of air deteriorates so much because smoke. And I'm speaking of Pakistan and Lahore. Things are just as bad in Delhi and all the area in between Lahore and Delhi. So and doing something about this is entirely under our remit, and yet it doesn't get done.
Absolutely, and that's a problem that didn't have a solution even theoretically. And in 2023, I raised my people to come up with a clean air policy, a national clean air policy, after consulting the 4 provinces. And obviously the province which is most impacted, which is right now flooded, the breadbasket of the country. So is Sindh, by the way. Both are breadbaskets. Punjab is now has a border cutting through it with India. And there's an Indian Punjab, which is equally polluted or perhaps more. The common problem they have is that 2 common problems. They burn agricultural crop residue They burn it in big numbers. And farmers just can't seem to stop doing this as a cheap, low-cost way of just getting rid of the crop residue. That creates something known as, well, it mixes in winter air with something called particulate matter and other sulfurous, noxious,
Which is from poor quality
Of-
petrol.
also from fuel,
Yeah.
but also anyway, so we decided to say, okay, whatever you can, because it's not like the emissions problem that global warming is bringing. You can you can change your fuel mix, you can start electrifying your vehicles because transport is at least a 25% emitter. They say the numbers are lower, they're just not. I don't accept that. And there, I provided them low-cost solutions like unglamorous things like tune your vehicle, right? Have it fit for purpose on the street and not emit the black smoke until you make the transition to Euro 5 or 6 fuel, which is expensive. And the petrol stations are not able to, the import of oil is of that level of petroleum is not doable right now. Our power sector is quite crippled. We've been talking about other things, but our power sector is part of the problem, the petroleum sector. And so that one is not such an easy transition, but what you can do is start tuning your vehicles. You can start substituting electric stoves for wood stoves in homes where women are battling with, the old, it's called a chula in South Asia. It's a stove and it causes a complete choke within the kitchen area and as well as outside. So those kind of steps and of course the crop burning. And the last point was, both the Punjab have something called brick kilns where they make, red brick, the Simra soil, and you just have to install what is known as a clean air zigzag technology in the furnaces and the black smoke becomes white. But that costs money. So we were able to subsidize part of and these are usually less affluent entrepreneurs. So we subsidize them for at least 20% of Islamabad's brick kilns are now white. I would urge you to take a picture and put it on X or social media. That's what I do. And sometimes there are arrests. But so are the big cement and big emitters, the big polluters. So our caucus fined one of very big cement mills and they were shut down. I think in our terms here, it would be $1 million. It was a huge sum because what they were doing, people are very creative in South Asia, okay? They got an order to slap a ban in the day, then in the night they will pollute. So you can't see if it's black fumes. Very creative. All of South Asia is very creative. But I do want to say one thing. You do need this is one border issue like water. We share, this is a transboundary issue. And that is something both the Punjabs need to work on. They do not. Lahore and New Delhi vie for the first position as most polluted cities in the world. They're always vying for that. And so we suggested to our CM Punjab Chief Minister make the offer. She did, and she was laughed at by CM Punjab India. And that's where we're at. And I think 45 minutes have come to a close, Ijaz. So I can talk on for another.
But maybe we can take one or two questions before we conclude.
Is the reason why the COP process has failed due to the fact that we have these nationally determined contributions which are voluntary? But instead, if you assign the carbon budget to different countries under different temperature scenarios, would that be a better way for it to work?
I don't know, you tell me.
Question is to
I
you.
mean, why would other countries do get different carbon budgets? They all don't declare uniform NDCs. So they do have different, I don't know what you mean. Pakistan has a net zero path, which is very different from, say, the UK's, right? Or Beijing's, so every country has a different journey for net zero or what's called as nationally determined contributions. So yes, the carbon budget is different for everybody.
No, my question is that the emissions are becoming worse. So the desire for countries to implement more ambitious NDCs keep kicking in, right? So for in India's case, for instance, 2030-32 is by when they have to install 500 gigawatts of fossil fuel or renewable energy capacity. But now that's changed to about 850 in 2035. So is that the way to do it? Or is the better way to do it is to think of the carbon budget and then allocate that across countries in some way that they find consistent with?
So in the global stock take, what you call the carbon budget isn't really the actual carbon budget. It does not, it is out of context, it's outdated. Countries are declaring their own ambitions as per their ability to make the transition with or without help, right? So say India says, we're going to do this. The key word there that you mentioned was desire. It's based entirely on the intentions and desire of the country to be a good international actor acting in good faith. Nobody can hold anybody's feet to the fire if they don't. You have seen countries pulling right out of the agreement. So the desire term, I mean, that's the crux of the issue. The COPs make the rules, but they can't implement them. Nation states do that. And nation states are very busy making war these days. Since the Second World War, we have the highest number of conflicts in the world, from Africa to the Congo to the Ukraine to the West Asia. And that is not counted in what you call the carbon budgets of the COP. It was not done at Kyoto. It was not done at Paris. It has not been done till date. So 5.5% of global emissions are just coming from any random military activity. One example, 120 days of action on Gaza, for instance, is amounts to the, you can check this with a source called NEMA, because the UNFCCC is not making these data sets. It amounts to 27 individual countries' carbon emissions. 120 days of conflict, only one little country.
Please, go ahead.
Pleasure, Mr. Rahman. Great to see you again, Islamabad, now London. My question is, I think Pakistan, as a Pakistani, Pakistan did one great thing, is move the needle a little bit, if nothing else, on what is the perfect victim of ecological disaster and the environmental crisis. What tools did you develop and use to sort of move the needle as you did? I know you call it a hollow victory that, we got all these commitments and we had all of these policies set forth and people didn't make good on them. But it was the first time historically that it did happen, and it was a country like Pakistan doing so, which wasn't the perfect fit to lead that, perhaps. So how would other countries also do that to create that mounting pressure? If countries aren't going to voluntarily do it, can we create an international pressure large enough with those tools to get them there?
I think it's a question of, frankly, public commitment and leadership. You have a world now that is a multilateral forum, the United Nations, and a general global order, which is not an order at all. In that, such toolkits start rusting and not being very useful or fit for purpose. And you have a leaderless world right now. Please frame everything in context. Just like I said, when we're talking about COP, which you speak about emissions, the military and conflict emissions of any country are not counted. They need to be counted so we know what we're dealing with. That's the first given of any projection, right? Thank you.
Thank you.
One final question.
Okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your time. So completely agree with you on the dimension of protecting vulnerable people from increasingly common extreme events like heat waves. So in your view, when it comes to heat waves, what is the current policy agenda? Are you thinking more about avoiding exposure by people to heat waves, or are you thinking about allowing more people to have like in-place cooling without having to?
So there are two things. One is urban heating, which is called the heat bulb effect, and we have a fair amount of humidity in the south. It kind of adds to the claustrophobia of the heat. It's very claustrophobic, and the same temperature up north in, say, the mountains where I live, Islamabad, or my home city, is very different. 33 or 40 in Karachi will be experienced very differently with 40 in Islamabad. So yes, we had to create little, centers for cooling, meaning people can just shelters really, not air conditioned, because the air conditioning is creating another problem, right? A cascade of heating. So they and can't afford it either. So they're going in, and at least they have a shelter. They have ice water, drinking water. Then they have cool towels and medics, because old people they need immediate support. Some places we had to have the defibrillators, etc. There were deaths because of heat waves, and it's very difficult because people still say, look, we've got to earn a wage.
Okay.
Can I just
Sure.
leave this young man with one last thing? Yeah. So we're going into the 2022 floods relief effort, and you should think about this. We're giving dengue and malaria is rising from the stagnant water. It's an offshoot of all of that. So the WHO is there, all of us are there. And I remember going into a tent with the foreign minister at that time, which was Bilawal Bhutto, and we asked, where's the mosquito net? Your family's sitting here without that. And they're saying, look, we gave it to the buffalo. You know why? Because that's their future. And that buffalo had the mosquito net. So I used to say, okay, the problem is the buffalo versus my 3 daughters. And here we're doing a flat white or a double espresso. So that's the difference, the scale of the price. I don't mean to trivialize it, but we thought it was very, very tragic that and real that he wanted to ensure a future for the family, and they'd all agreed. So that's the kind of snapshot you see at ground zero, really. And so the heat centers are the heat centers. They are what they are. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Much appreciated. Bottom line is that cops are fine, but we should all get our own act together.
Luckily, we did ask about
I know you're probably.
Stuck here for the next guy.